order. Will members wishing to take their seats please come to the table?
Do you wish to swear that you're a fan?
Okay, I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heirs and successors according to law.
Do you wish to swear or affirm?
On the Bible.
King James?
I swear by Almighty God that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heirs and successors, according to law, so help me God.
Thank you.
I swear by Almighty God that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heir successors, according to law. So help me God.
Thank you very much. Do you wish to swear?
Yes, swear.
King James Version.
Thank you. I swear by Almighty God that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heirs and successors, according to law. So help me God.
Do you want to state your name and constituency?
Stephen Flynn, Aberdeen South.
Do you wish to swear or affirm?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heirs and successors according to law.
Very much.
I will now announce the arrangements for the ballot for the election of deputy speakers. The ballot will be held in Committee Room 8 from 10 a.m. to 1:30 on Wednesday, the 8th of January. Nominations shall be submitted to the table office between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. on Tuesday, the 7th of January. Nomination forms and a briefing note with more details about the election are available in the table office. The Super Hub and Vote Office. I hope this is helpful to colleagues. We now come to motion number 1 on the adjournment. Minister to move formally. The question is as on the order paper. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to motion number 2 on the allocation of select committee chairs. Minister to move formally. The question is as on the order paper. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. 230 motion, Minister to move forward. Clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill, second reading.
No, selected any reasonable.
Just I inform the House that I have not selected any of the reasonable amendments. The Minister to move. Order. Before I invite the Minister to move the second reading, I must announce my decision on certification for the purposes of Standing Order number 83J. This is certification of the bills, etc., as relating exclusively to England or England and Wales and being devolved to legislative competence. On the basis of material put before me, I must inform the House that, in my opinion, the bill does not meet the criteria required for certification under the Standing Order. Minister to move second reading, or Prime Minister to move second reading.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I beg to move that the bill be read a second time, and that we come together as a new Parliament to break the deadlock and finally to get Brexit done. Now is the moment, as we leave the European Union, to reunite our country and allow the warmth and natural affection that we all share for our European neighbours to find renewed expression in one great new national project of building a deep, special and democratically accountable partnership with those nations we are proud to call our closest friends. Because this bill and this juncture in our national story, Mr. Speaker, must not be seen as a victory for one party over another or one faction over another. This is the time when we move on and discard the old labels of leave and remain. In fact, the very words seem tired to me as I speak, as defunct as big enders and little enders, or Montagues and Capulets at the end of the play. Now is the time to act together as one reinvigorated nation, one united kingdom, filled with renewed confidence in our national destiny and determined at last to take advantage of the opportunities that now lie before us. And the whole purpose of our withdrawal agreement is to set this in motion and avoid any further delay. And in the hope that the honourable gentleman does not wish to have any further delay, I give way to him.
Grateful to the Prime Minister for giving way. The bill contains provisions not to extend the transition phase, or phase 2 of Brexit. It does not endanger strengthening the hand of the European Union in those negotiations. Why has he boxed himself into a corner?
On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, I think most people looking at the negotiation would agree that it strengthens our negotiating position. Because if we have learned anything from the experience of the last 3 years, it is that drift and dither means more acrimony and anguish, Mr. Speaker, and there will be nothing more dangerous for the new future that we want to build than allowing the permanent possibility of extending, I think I'm coming to the point that honourable members wish to discuss, extending the implementation period in a torture we all remember that came to resemble Lucy snatching away Charlie Brown's football, or Prometheus chained to the Tartarian crag, his liver pecked out by an eagle and then growing back, as honourable members on all sides of the House will recall, and then growing back only to be pecked out again in the cycle repeated forever. This bill learns the emphatic lesson of the last Parliament, unlike members opposite, and rejects any further delay. It ensures that we depart from the EU on the 31st of January, and at that point Brexit will be done. It will be over. The sorry story of the last 3.5 years will be at an end, and we will be able to move forward, Mr. Speaker, together. The bill ensures that the implementation period must end on the 31st of December next year with no possibility of an extension. And it paves the way for a new agreement on our future relationship with our European neighbours based on an ambitious free trade agreement, with no alignment, with no alignment on EU rules, but instead control of our own laws. And close and friendly relations, Mr. Speaker. This vision of the United Kingdom's independence, a vision that inspires so many, is now, if this Parliament, this new Parliament allows, only hours from our grasp. The oven is on, so to speak. It is set at gas mask 4. We can have it done by lunchtime or late lunch. And the New Deal that I negotiated with our European friends will restore our great institutions to their rightful place as the supreme instruments of British self-governance. Once again, this House will be the only assembly able to legislate for this United Kingdom. British courts will be the sole arbiters of those laws, and above them all, the sovereign British people, masters of their own fate, controlling their own borders, laws, money and trade. And throughout our new immigration system, we will not only welcome those with talent, but go out of our way to attract people of ability regardless of nationality or background. And we are only able to do this because the freedoms offered by our European Union partners, the freedoms offered by leaving the EU, allow us once again to control overall numbers and bear down on unskilled immigration with our new points-based system. And if the Honourable Lady, if she's against our new the control of immigration, I'd like to hear her explain why.
The Prime Minister has spoken about welcoming people to these islands. Clause 37 of the Prime Minister's bill removes the government's existing obligations with regard to unaccompanied children seeking asylum in the European Union who want to join their family members in the United Kingdom. Lord Dobbs has described this removal of a right as mean-spirited and nasty. Can the government tell me, or can the Prime Minister tell me, why he is making this mean-spirited and nasty move?
I'm afraid the Honourable Lady has totally misunderstood or possibly misrepresented the purpose of what we are doing here. We remain proud of our work in receiving unaccompanied children. We'll continue to support fully the purpose and spirit of the Dobbs Amendment, but this is not the place in this bill to do so. The government remains absolutely committed to doing so. And amongst the many other advantages of this deal, Mr. Speaker, is of course that we will be able to sign free trade deals with the booming markets of the world, a power that no British government has enjoyed for the last 46 years. We will cast off the common agricultural policy that has too often frustrated and overburdened our farmers. We will release our fishermen from the tangled drift nets of arcane quota systems, and on the fishing, I give way to my right honourable friend on the point of fishing.
Most grateful, my honourable friend. I offer my heartiest congratulations. There will be no communities more keen to get control back than fishing communities. Yeah. Will he guarantee that we will not make the mistake of the 1970s? We will not allow allocation of fishing resources to be a bargaining chip in the treaty negotiations. We will become like a normal, independent maritime nation and conduct negotiations on an annual basis for reciprocal deals to mutual advantage.
Well, my right honourable friend perfectly understands what we need to do to restore to this country the advantages of its spectacular marine wealth, and that is exactly what we will do once we become an independent coastal state. And I remind the House, and I remind members opposite, that there is, of course, one party in this House of Commons that is committed not just to reversing the will of the people, but to handing back control of Scotland's outstanding marine wealth to Brussels. The SNP. That's what they would do, and I look forward to hearing them explain why they continue to support this abject policy and abject surrender. This House also, under this bill, regains the authority to set the highest possible standards, and we will take advantage of these new freedoms to legislate in parallel on the environment, on workers and consumers' rights. And I reject the inexplicable fear. And I'm going to give way to the last time, because I think that the Honourable Lady maybe want to talk about this inexplicable fear. I give way with pleasure.
I'm grateful to the Prime Minister, and he is right that he has won a mandate to get Brexit done. But what he has not earned is the right to shoehorn into this legislation measures that are a direct attack on some of the most vulnerable children in the world. If he thinks that people in towns like mine who believe that we deliver Brexit want to see us turn our back on decency and tolerance and kindness and warmth and empathy, he is wrong. Will he take these measures about child refugees out of this bill?
I may say, I understand where the Honourable Lady is coming from, but I like the Honourable Lady who speaks for the Scottish Nationalists. She is wrong on this point. We remain absolutely committed to ensuring that we continue in this country to receive unaccompanied children, as we have done, and we've led Europe. We've received thousands already. This country has a proud record, and we will continue to do so. And I thought she was going to say that this House would be unable to legislate or regulate on the environment in a way superior to the European Union, but that is what we will now be able to do. And I reject the idea that our proceedings must be somehow overseen and invigilated by the EU and measured against their benchmarks. The very essence of the opportunity of Brexit is that we will no longer outsource these decisions. With renewed national self-confidence, we will take them ourselves and answer to those who sent us here. It was this Parliament in this country, that led the whole of Europe and the world in passing the Factory Acts, the Clean Air Acts of the 19th century, which improved industrial working conditions by law. And this House should never doubt its ability to pioneer standards for the fourth industrial revolution, just as we did the first. And that epoch-making transformation, as with all the pivotal achievements of British history, reflected the combined national genius of every corner of this United Kingdom. In this new era, our success once again will be achieved as one nation. This New Deal in this bill ensures that the United Kingdom will leave the EU whole and entire, with an unwavering dedication to Northern Ireland's place in our Union. And on that point, I, of course, happily give way to the Right Honourable Gentleman.
Very grateful, Mr. Speaker, to the Prime Minister. It almost thought we'd fallen out, but I am pleased that he took the intervention. The Prime Minister knows that he has the strength from this election to deliver Brexit. He also knows that we want to deliver Brexit. But we want to deliver Brexit as one nation. And I'm glad that that terminology and that phraseology is being re-injected into this debate. But he needs to understand the concerns about the customs arrangements for Northern Ireland, tariff differentials, the potential for checks, and he needs to understand the concerns we share because we want to ensure we leave as one nation. And we're not going to resolve those issues today, but will the Prime Minister commit to proper and thorough and detailed reconsideration, using the strength he has to deliver for the entirety of this country?
Of course, Mr. Speaker, I understand the point that the honourable gentleman raises, but let me remind him that the deal commits to unfettered access between all parts of the UK. It respects the territorial integrity of the UK and ensures that Northern Ireland is part of the UK customs territory and would therefore benefit immediately from any of our new free trade deals as soon as they are in force. And let me just remind the House, Mr. Speaker, that the special provisions applying to Northern Ireland, which ensure, after all, a very important thing, that there is no hard border across the between Ireland and Northern Ireland, are subject to the consent of the Northern Ireland Assembly. And unless the Assembly specifically withholds its consent, unless indeed the Assembly insists on continuing with this approach, then those arrangements automatically lapse into full alignment with the rest of the UK. And I believe that these arrangements serve the interests of Northern Ireland and the UK as a whole. And it is a great deal for our whole country. And we must now begin building our future relationship with the EU. Our aim is to provide a close friendship between sovereign equals, to promote our common interests, inspired by pride in our European heritage and civilization. And Clause 3 of the Political Declaration invokes that spirit, establishing, and I quote, the parameters of an ambitious, broad, deep and flexible partnership, rooted in our shared history and ideals, and standing together against threats to rights and values from without or within. I am absolutely determined that this great project will not be the project of one government or one party, but of the British nation as a whole. So Parliament, as I have said, will be kept fully informed about the progress of these negotiations. And we should be fortified by a renewed sense of confidence that while our democratic... I think I've given way quite a few times, Mr. Speaker. Come on. In all fairness. and the policy of the Liberal Democrats is now to have another referendum. They've abandoned revoke. They now want another referendum. So I think when they work their policy out, I'll give way. We should be fortified. We should be fortified by a renewed. We should be fortified by a renewed sense of confidence that while our democratic institutions have been tested as never before, if this House comes together now to support this bill, as I hope it will, history will record that the first act of this new Parliament in its earliest days was to break the ice floes and find a new way through, a new passage through to unsuspected oceans of opportunity. And so now is the moment to come together and write a new and exciting chapter in our national story, to forge a new partnership with our European friends, to stand tall in the world, to begin the healing for which the whole people of this country yearn. And it is in that spirit of unity that I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the bill now be read a second time. Leader of the Opposition, the Right Honourable Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the last 3.5 years, the government's mishandling of Brexit has delivered nothing but political gridlock, chaos and economic uncertainty. It's paralysed our political system, divided communities and nations, and become a national embarrassment on an unprecedented scale. We recognise the clear message from the British public last week, however they voted in the referendum of 2016, and understand their determination to end the never-ending cycle of the Brexit debate and get back to solving the day-to-day issues that challenge them in their daily lives. So we must listen and understand that we cannot go on forever debating what happened in 2016, and we have to respect that decision and move on. However, Mr. Speaker, understanding all this doesn't mean that we as a party and a movement should abandon our basic principles or ever give up the demand for a fairer and more just society. We warned before the general election the Prime Minister's Brexit deal was a terrible deal for our country, and we still believe it's a terrible deal today. I'll give way later on. It will not protect or strengthen our rights, or support our manufacturing industry, or our vital trading relationships, or protect our natural world in a time of unprecedented climate crisis. Neither will it address the deep inequality in our system or secure the interests of every nation and region in the United Kingdom. Instead, under the Conservatives, this deal will be used as a battering ram to drive us down the path of yet more deregulation and towards a toxic deal with Donald Trump that will sell out our National Health Service and push up the price of medicines to benefit US drug corporations. It will take us away from the essential principles we believe in, of a country that looks after everybody and protects those communities left behind by the excesses of the free market. This deal does not bring certainty for communities or for business or the workforce. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it does the opposite and hardwires the risk of a no-deal Brexit next year. I'm sure that will delight many members on the benches opposite, but not those who suffer the consequences in communities and workplaces all across the country. That is why Labour will not support this bill. As we remain certain, there is a better and fairer way for this country to leave the European Union. One which would not risk ripping our communities apart, selling out our public services, or sacrificing hundreds of thousands of jobs in the process. This deal is a roadmap for the reckless direction in which the government and our Prime Minister are determined to take our country. They have done their utmost to hide the likely impact and continue to use gimmicks and slogans to turn attention away from their real intentions.
For the right honourable gentleman, but surely the people have voted in a general election and supported the Prime Minister's deal. As a Democrat, surely he should heed the people.
I'm disappointed in the honourable member. He clearly... But in the spirit of Christmas, I wish him well. He hasn't been listening to what I've said. Mr. Speaker, on the questions, and nothing exposes this government's intentions more clearly than the steps they've already taken on workers' rights. For all the promises over the past few weeks that they are the party to protect rights at work, at the very first opportunity, they've removed the basic provisions they said would be part of this bill. That does not bode well for the separate bill the Prime Minister is now saying he will bring forward on workers' rights. If he wants to assure people that their rights are safe in his hands, he should commit to legislate to ensure workers' rights in Britain will never fall behind the European Union standards in the future, and support amendments to enshrine this commitment within this bill. Yes.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for giving way. We are all concerned in this House with workers' rights. And indeed on the rights of those who are approaching retirement. He put his policy to the British people, in as much as anyone could discern it, in a general election. He was slaughtered. What bit of that message does he not understand?
The Prime Minister, your leader, if I may say so, Mr. Speaker, said the workers' rights were going to be protected. They are not in this bill. So, Mr. Speaker,
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. Isn't the whole point of this that this withdrawal agreement seems to be diminishing every time? The previous Prime Minister, the right honourable member for Maidenhead deal, this is worse than that. The one that we had before the election, there's things that have vanished. It's not only workers' rights that are being downgraded here, it's parliamentarians' rights, because the ability of the legislature to scrutinise the executive has been taken away here. It's bad for democracy.
Thank my friend for the intervention. She's absolutely correct on what she says. And then, Mr. Speaker, I now move on to what I think is one of the most appalling sections of this bill and what the Prime Minister has presented to us this morning. I want to make it clear that I see the government's removal of the protections in this bill for unaccompanied children seeking asylum as nothing short of an absolute disgrace and a piece of dishonesty towards those people who at the moment are clearly very, very concerned. Throughout the last Parliament and for his whole life, and I was talking to him last night, my good friend Lord Dubs has worked tirelessly to ensure children affected by the worst aspects of global injustice can be given sanctuary in this country. Now, this government, in its first week in office, has ripped up those very hard-won commitments. This is a move the director of the charity Safe Passage has described, and I quote, as truly shocking, saying it could have, and I quote again, potentially tragic consequences. I simply say this, Mr. Speaker, coming up to Christmas, shame on this government for abandoning children in this way. Mr. Speaker, on the environment and food safety standards, this deal points to a complete realignment towards the far weaker protections and standards that operate in the United States. If this government is set on pursuing a trade deal with the United States, with President Trump, with precious few bargaining chips to hand, the brutal reality is that Britain will have to lower its standards. That is the brutal reality of it. The European Union has made it clear that a future trade deal with the European Union will depend on maintaining a level playing field on standards and protections. So the choice we now face is between keeping the highest environmental and food standards in order to get a future trade deal with the European Union, or slashing food standards to match those of the United States, where there are so-called acceptable levels of rat hairs in paprika, maggots in orange juice. It's true. If members think this is a piece of imagination on my part, when I was first told this, I also thought that cannot be the case. I checked out, and it absolutely is. We are about to strike a new race to the bottom in a deal with the United States, and I think everyone should be aware and warned of that. Mr. Speaker, turning to the arrangements with Northern Ireland, the Prime Minister has emphatically claimed, and I quote his own words, there will be no checks between Northern Ireland and GB. And that, again I quote, we have a deal that keeps the whole of the UK together as we come out of the EU. These claims are simply not true. We know from the analysis carried out by his own Treasury that under his deal there will be, in fact, an abundance of checks and customs declarations in the Irish Sea. Not only will this have a huge impact on Northern Ireland businesses and society, it will also have implications for the rest of Britain's economy and manufacturing industry. The Treasury's own analysis spells it out. The more the government diverges from the EU trading regulations in the future, the more checks and disruptions will be put in place between Britain and our biggest trading partner. More checks, more disruption is deeply damaging to our trade and for our manufacturing sector, threatens taking a wrecking ball to our vital supply chains and the hundreds of thousands of jobs that rely on them. Car manufacturers, chemical industry, all those that rely on just-in-time supply chains will feel a devastating impact from all this. This makes it even more incredible that since agreeing its deal, the government has yet to produce one single bit of evidence or analysis to show it will have a positive impact on the economy or our communities in any way. I say to all members, new and old, that it is our job in Parliament to question, to scrutinise and to hold the government to account day to day. If we believe the government is taking the wrong approach, we should never be afraid to oppose. And when it comes to our future relationship with the European Union and the rest of the world, we cannot let this government act in an undemocratic and secretive way. Trade deals with the EU and the United States, or anybody else for that matter, must be done transparently. This country is about, Mr. Speaker, to embark on a major change of direction. As we leave a 40-year economic partnership for an unknown future under the terms of the withdrawal deal, we need, Mr. Speaker, an approach that puts jobs and living standards first and builds the strongest cooperation with our European neighbours, based on openness, solidarity and internationalism. And that, Mr. Speaker, is the approach that will bring an end to the Brexit crisis and bring our country together.
Dr. Liam Fox.
They don't share at once.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This debate is the beginning of a promise fulfilled. Not simply a promise fulfilled by this party, although it is certainly that. It is a promise fulfilled by this Parliament to the people of this country. When we embarked on the Brexit process, we offered Parliament a decision to the British people. We said that we cannot or will not make a decision about our future relationship with the European Union. The people of this country will take that decision, and Parliament will respect that decision. We have had 3 years of the betrayal of that pact made with the British people in a previous Parliament that simply would not honour the manifesto commitments on which 80% of the last Parliament had been elected. Those who wilfully signed up to a manifesto saying that it would honour the referendum result and then came to this House and betrayed that did not enjoy their first democratic contact with their voters. And I'm proud that so many of my new colleagues are taking the place of those who did not want it. It is also an opportunity, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, a historic opportunity for you to repair some of the damage done to the reputation to the chair of this House by some of the decisions made by your predecessor, and we wish you well in that great historic task. Can I say to my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, he's absolutely right not to enter onto a period of constant extension to our implementation period with the European Union. There could be nothing that would give the EU less incentive to come to a final agreement with the UK than embarking on such a process. And having had the torture of the last few years, where we saw endless increases in the time frame, we need not go through that again. I'll give way to honourable friend.
Does my right honourable friend agree that given Australia negotiated trade deals with Japan, South Korea and China all within 18 months, there is no reason we cannot negotiate a good trade deal with the EU by the end of next year, given we've had 47 years of integration, as long as there's goodwill on their side?
My honourable friend puts his finger on the most important point. It's not a technical issue we will face, it's a political issue that we will face. Indeed, the political declaration sets out that we will have no tariffs, no fees and no quotas in the economic relationship ahead. That's what normally takes up the time in trading agreements, so it's entirely possible that it can be done. But the debate, Mr. Speaker, is that we will be embarking upon is not one about tariffs and fees and quotas. It's about regulatory alignment. That will be the central debate in the negotiations we have with the European Union, and we need to see this in a wider global context. At the WTO meeting in Buenos Aires, it became clear that in the global trading system there are two ways forward. One is the concept of harmonisation, a highly legalistic, regulatory means of doing business that says this is the way we do it today, therefore this is the way we'll always do it in the future. Against that, there is the wider concept of outcome-based equivalence, which says, yes, we know what standards we need to meet, but we want to find our own ways, our own rules, our own efficiencies in achieving that particular outcome. And the EU is now in a real minority. It is virtually only the EU that takes the route of harmonisation. And there are those in the forthcoming negotiations who will say that for access to the single market, Britain must accept dynamic alignment. In other words, we must automatically change our rules in line with the EU. Can I say to the Prime Minister, he will have 100% support from the Conservative Party by ruling out any concept of dynamic alignment, which would leave Britain in a worse place in terms of taking back control than we actually have as a member of the European Union. Mr. Speaker, this debate that we are embarking upon is a clear choice. There was never at any point in the European debate the option of maintaining the status quo, because we either had to embark on our own course, controlling our own borders, our funds, our own future, or we were tied to an economic and political model of the European Union that's utterly dependent on ever closer union. I never have believed that ever closer union was in Britain's national interest. And if the bus has got the wrong destination on the front, then the best thing to do is to get off the bus, which is what the British people decided to do. I give way to my honourable friend.
I agree with my right honourable friend. Does he not recall that the Leader of the Opposition spent his time sneering at the standards in the United States, a democratic and advanced economy? But one of the points that he was making is correct. If you look at their standards, when it comes to campylobacterial infection and also salmonella, they have fewer deaths per capita than the UK or the European Union. They get there by different methods, and they get there better than we do, so we should stop sneering.
Well, I hope that my right honourable friend will forgive me if I don't take too much notice of an anti-wealth, anti-American, anti-trade, tired old lefty rhetoric that we get from the soon-to-be forgotten leader of the opposition. The debate that we have, Mr. Speaker, is a very clear one. The Prime Minister is leading Britain in a direction which will produce a confident, outward-looking European Union. To many of us, leaving the European Union wasn't because Europe was foreign. It's in an era of globalisation. Europe was not foreign enough. It spent too much time gazing at its own navel and worrying about political integration. We are embarked upon a historic and correct course for our nation. And I go back, Mr. Speaker, to where I began on this question of trust, and I say this in the spirit of the season, that I hope that even Hugh Grant will watch our seasonal offering this year, which is democracy, actually.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman, right honourable gentleman from North Somerset. I must say, when I was listening to him, you can already see the red lines that caused the problem for the previous Prime Minister that are coming back, that were to do a trade deal by the end of 2020. But at the same time, we're not to have any degree of alignment with the European Union. But when we hear talk of writing into this bill that it's to be a matter of legislation, that there will be no extension, that is a matter of politics, and if a government can legislate for that today, equally it can legislate to remove that burden before the end of 2020. And I predict, Mr. Speaker, that that may indeed end up the position that we're in, because the harsh reality is that by placing that deadline, that risk of a no-deal Brexit that we all fear is very much back on the table again. Mr. Speaker, Scotland could not have been clearer last week. We did not vote for Brexit, and returning the SNP with a greater mandate shows Scotland still totally and utterly rejects Brexit. Yet the Prime Minister is blindly hurtling towards the cliff edge with these deeply damaging Brexit plans that will leave us poorer, that will leave us worse off. This legislation will hit our economy, cost thousands of jobs in Scotland, sell out our food and drink sector and harm people's livelihoods. Mr. Speaker, the Scottish National Party will not vote for this flawed and deeply damaging legislation. We reject this toxic Brexit legislation and make the case clear that this UK government cannot drag Scotland out of the European Union before gaining the legislative consent of the Scottish Parliament. And my question to the Prime Minister, will he accept that the devolved administrations have that right to withhold their legislative consent? Will he now enter into constructive dialogue with those that seek to defend our rights, our Parliament in Edinburgh and our First Minister? Because we know the reality is that this Prime Minister will ignore Scotland. He'll keep ploughing ahead. Despite the fact that Scotland voted to remain in the European Union, and at last week's general election, Scotland voted decisively to escape Brexit and put Scotland's future in Scotland's hands. A Prime Minister with no mandate to drag Scotland out of the European Union. It's clearer than ever, Mr. Speaker, that the people of Scotland must have their say over their future rather than the broken Brexit Britain that he wishes to impose upon us.
Would he give way?
Mr. Speaker, our economy will be smaller, weaker and poorer as a result of leaving the European Union. Why? Because of the ideology of the Brexit fanboys, those in the Leave EU campaign that now run this government. Mr. Speaker, despite the Prime Minister's assertions, Brexit is already having an impact on our economy. Analysis in Scotland's Chief Economist's State of the Economy report shows that continuing uncertainty is resulting in a £500 million shortfall to business investment in Scotland. That, Mr. Speaker, is the price of Brexit. And, Mr. Speaker, it doesn't matter whether it's this Brexit or another Brexit. The analysis shows that all forms of Brexit will harm Scotland's economy and result in lower household incomes. I will give way.
Grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. He will be aware that before the referendum, we were told that if the country voted to leave, there would be economic Armageddon, that there'd be rising unemployment, rising interest rates, and so on. None of it none of it actually materialised. Why does he persist in scaremongering when it hasn't materialised in the past, and it's about time that he had confidence in the United Kingdom and looked at the cup being half full rather than half empty? Look at the evidence.
Mr. Speaker, let me say to the honourable gentleman that we've looked at the evidence. I've just given him the fact of lower investment in Scotland, and the fact is, when Brexit happened, that the pound fell, that inflation rose. And let me just give him two examples of the stupidity of those that want to push ahead with this project. We lost the jobs of the European Banking Authority. We lost the jobs of the European Medicines Agency. 2,000 well-paid jobs lost in London. And why? And the Prime Minister sits in his seats and he laughs. He laughs about the loss of these institutions, centred here in London, the loss of influence that we have over the importance of new medicines coming to the United Kingdom, because that's what Brexit is going to do. Scotland's place in Europe provided detailed analysis on the macroeconomic implications of Brexit for the Scottish economy, outlining that membership of the European Single Market and Customs Union is the least worst option for jobs and investment. We sought to compromise with the UK government on that, yet this government is here, ripping us out of these markets, risking great instability and economic chaos. The members on the opposite benches are quite prepared to reduce jobs and opportunities simply on the basis of ideology. Mr. Speaker, membership is vital for trade. In 2017, Scotland exported £14.9 billion of goods to the European Union. Closing down membership of the single market and the customs union is closing down opportunities for Scottish businesses. And it's not just goods, but people that this government is looking to lock down opportunities for. Mr. Speaker, approximately 209,000 EU citizens live in Scotland, bringing in new skills and expertise. Skills and expertise absolutely vital to our industries and to the local economy. Now, Mr. Speaker, in the debate earlier on, in an intervention from my honourable friend from Edinburgh South West, the issue of unaccompanied minors was raised. And I have to say that on the basis of the response for the Prime Minister, he clearly hasn't read his own bill and explanatory notes, because let me just read what it says. Clause 37 amends subsection 1 of section 17 of the EU Withdrawal Act 2018 to remove, Mr. Speaker, the obligation to seek to negotiate an agreement and replace it with the requirement to make a statement to Parliament. That is the harsh reality. And I say to honourable and right honourable members opposite, think very carefully. Think very carefully as to what you're about to do, because you're just about to bring up the drawbridge. Bring up the drawbridge and stop that right of unaccompanied minors coming to the United Kingdom. What a disgrace! Why is it in there then? What a disgrace! Why is it in there? And a real indication of who are the real separatists, who are the real isolationists in the way that they are seeking to behave. And we should be very afraid of what this Conservative government is seeking to do. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is simply not interested in Scotland's economy. He has made clear with his manifesto mantra that it's all about getting Brexit done. Getting the Prime Minister's Brexit done will leave the United Kingdom £70 worse off than if it had remained in the European Union. That's according to a study by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. And we know, Mr. Speaker, that the Tories couldn't care less about Scotland, because Scotland, alone of the United Kingdom nations, is being singled out for unfair treatment. The only United Kingdom country to be taken out of the European Union against our will, and with no say, Mr. Speaker, no say whatsoever as to our future. England and Wales voted leave. England and Wales will leave. Northern Ireland is getting a special deal and the right to decide their own future. The Prime Minister offers Scotland nothing. Nothing. Hee-haw. Diddly squat. That's what we get from this government and its so-called precious union. Nothing but disrespect for our government and our rights. I'll give you this one.
He mentions England and Wales, but in the last election, 16.5 million people voted for Remain parties and 14.5 million for Leave, and the Remain vote was divided. So doesn't he agree that the least this government can do is to provide democratic scrutiny to have a soft Brexit that allows alignment with workers' rights, with environment, and scrutiny, all importantly, over trade deals with the United States and elsewhere?
Well, of course there has to be effective scrutiny, but on that specific issue, the legislation offers no guarantees on workers and environmental standards or, Mr Speaker, protection for the NHS from a future trade deal with the US. Of course, we know it will hit jobs and living standards. It will leave Scottish businesses possibly facing a competitive disadvantages with businesses in Northern Ireland. And the Prime Minister can talk about trade deals all he wants. But the harsh reality is that the basic trade agreement of the type he wants to negotiate will lead to GDP being lower by the equivalent of £1,600 per person compared with EU membership. You know, people are going to be worse off, and people can watch and listen to this debate, and what they hear are honourable members and right honourable members opposite laughing. That's the seriousness that they show to these crucial issues. Mr Speaker, is it any wonder that the people of Scotland, armed with the facts, aware of the deceit from a Vote Leave campaign and the Brexiteers in Number 10, came out in huge numbers last week and backed the Scottish National Party to escape this government's disastrous Brexit? And escaping Brexit is now the only option to protect our economy. We tried time and time again to compromise, but the Tories simply are not listening to Scotland. That is why yesterday Scotland's First Minister wrote to the Prime Minister to transfer power from the United Kingdom Government to hold a referendum of independence to the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Government has a clear democratic mandate from the 2016 Holyrood election to offer the people of Scotland a choice over Scotland's future within the terms of this Parliament. There is a significant and material change in the circumstances that prevailed in 2014. And let me just nail once and for all this issue about once in a generation, because it was made clear in the declaration that was signed between the two governments that it did not obstruct a future independence referendum. That, Mr Speaker, is the fact of the matter.
Go back to David Cameron.
Mr Speaker, last week we won that mandate again. Scotland must consent to its own future. Westminster's arrogance and ignorance has treated Scotland with contempt for too long. It would simply be undemocratic to ignore the will and the voice and the ask of the Scottish people. If the Tories think Scotland doesn't want independence, then give us our say. What is to be feared by more democracy? Everything has changed. And that's why, Mr Speaker, the Scottish National Party today demand, if the Prime Minister isn't running scared, give Scotland its choice, its right to choose its own future. We have a way out of this Brexit mess, and I appeal to those in Scotland who have supported other parties. Come with us. Complete the powers of our Parliament. We can escape Brexit. We can take our own responsibilities. There is a better way out that will secure our economy, allow us to tackle inequality and to deal with the climate emergency. It is not this Tory Brexit. We can save ourselves from that. Mr Speaker, it is time for Scottish independence.
Come on, let's start as we mean to go. What I'm going to suggest is to help everybody that I'm going to bring in an informal 6-minute limit to give everybody equal time to get through. Maria Miller.
Thank you, Mr Deputy
Deputy Speaker, and it's a great pleasure to rise in this first debate that you're chairing today and to welcome your approach to chairing debates in this chamber. Thank you very much for that. So much has been said on Brexit already. People who are tuning in to watch our debate today on the Parliament channel could be forgiven for thinking they're watching a rerun. And I know it's Christmas, but come on, we need to get this debate to move forward. It's not good enough that we're just repeating the same arguments that have been repeated in this place for the last three years, because people expect more of us from us than that. And time away from this place can be a valuable thing, and all of us who are returning members of Parliament have had 6 weeks away from this place. 6 weeks to listen to the people that we are representing, that we were talking to throughout the campaign. And I know from speaking to colleagues, not just on this side, but across the House, that we were all getting a similar message, that people felt frustrated about the way Parliament was acting, that people felt that we were locked in a standoff on the issue of Brexit, that they felt the country was being trapped in a situation that we should not be in, and that we should be allowed to be able to move forward, regardless of their political party. And this withdrawal agreement that we're debating here today gives us that opportunity to move forward. It gives us the opportunity to be able to get Brexit done so that we can start to focus on those issues that we know our constituents feel are so important. But, Mr. Speaker, I think this debate today gives us one other opportunity, which all of us, whether we're new members of Parliament, returning members of Parliament, need to seize. And that is the opportunity to start to rebuild trust in this democratic institution. Because if we don't do that, it doesn't just damage the government, it doesn't just damage the front bench of this party, it damages all of us. If people don't have a trust in the representatives that are here in Westminster to speak on their behalf, and we have to take that very seriously. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. Does the honourable member trust that we will get a good free trade deal within 11 months, rather than the average of 5 to 7 years?
I think the honourable gentleman needs to reflect on the Conservative Party manifesto, which couldn't have been clearer and couldn't have been voted for by more people throughout the country. That people want to see this resolved as an issue. They don't want to see the deadlock. And I have to say that's regardless of whether they voted for to leave the EU in the first place or they voted to remain. Because we have this opportunity to rebuild trust. The Prime Minister, in his opening remarks, made a compelling case that we have to bring the country together, and this is our responsibility as members of Parliament. It is a shared endeavour. This angry politics, which I'm afraid we heard from the front bench of the Labour Party, has to end. It's our responsibility to set the right tone for our political debate in this country, and I'm afraid so far in this debate that hasn't been struck by all members. We have an opportunity to introduce a kinder politics here in our country, which will also help reduce the amount of abuse that I know so many members have had to endure over recent years. Mr. Speaker, I voted to stay in the EU, but I'm a Democrat, and that's why I will support the government's withdrawal agreement today. And I have supported every single opportunity to take forward our departure from the EU since the referendum 3 years ago. Politics isn't about constructing ivory towers. It's not about trying to put our ideology on the table at every opportunity. It's about finding solutions to very difficult problems. That is why we are sent here to Parliament. The withdrawal agreement is the start of the solution to what is, I believe, one of the most difficult problems our Parliament has faced in a generation. And I urge members across this House, regardless of what your party leaders are saying, is to reflect very deeply on that before you cast your vote tonight. because I think the voice of the nation spoke last Thursday, and we have to listen.
Who's next, Helen? Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. It is a great pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Member, and I agree with her in her argument that we need to be able to disagree agreeably, as I think President Obama once put it. Can I say to the Secretary of State that given that his department is going to be abolished at the very moment we leave the European Union, if he is looking for some consolation, can I point out it will mean he will no longer have to face the untrammelled joy of appearing before the Brexit Select Committee. And it gives me the opportunity to thank all of the members who have served on that committee and our wonderful team of clerks and advisers who has supported us with their expertise. At the heart of this bill is a gamble. It is a gamble with our nation's economy. Now, the Prime Minister has so much confidence in the government's ability to finalise a new relationship with the European Union by this time next year that this bill will prevent, by law, any extension of the transition period beyond December 2020. Now, if he succeeds, then his gamble will have paid off, although I wonder how detailed an agreement he will manage to achieve in that time. But if he fails, then the cliff edge of a no-deal Brexit beckons in just 12 months' time. Now, the pillar on which this confidence is built is the argument that because we have been aligned with the European Union for the last 40 or so years, then it should be a very easy deal to reach. But that argument would only have force if the government was planning to stay that closely aligned to the other 27 member states and their rules. But we know that that is not the case. The government wants to move away from European rules and regulations. Indeed, the Prime Minister said it today. No alignment with EU rules. And as that intention becomes clear to our EU negotiating partners, it will make the negotiations not simple, but much more complicated. So the question the House has to address, no doubt the bill will be passed today, is can a deal be completed when, as we have just heard, it took Canada 7 years to reach an agreement? Can it be completed in 12 months when we know we have to negotiate not just tariffs and quotas and rules of origin, but services? 80% of the British economy is built on the service sector. Data, aviation, medicine safety, cooperation on consumer rights, security, access to databases, which we will lose if we don't get this right, that help to keep us safe from terrorism. Foreign policy, cooperation on climate change, and a very long list of other matters that have huge importance for the British economy and British society. Of course I'll give way.
Gentlemen, and he has spent the last 12 months claiming that the Prime Minister never wanted to get a deal, and then he got one. Absolutely. Claiming the Prime Minister wasn't serious, therefore he had to produce a bill to hamstring this Parliament from progressing. Can he just for once admit we have a deal, that deal is going to happen this year, and use all his expertise and good services to rally round this Parliament, this government and this country to make sure we agree that deal by the end of the year and we can all move on at last?
I say to the right honourable gentleman that the bill that the last Parliament passed did not hamstrung the Prime Minister because he achieved a renegotiation. Although, to be fair, all he did was to accept 95% of his predecessor's deal and replace the backstop that was in it previously with a backstop that had been offered to the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead but had been rejected on grounds very clearly set out by the Prime Minister to the DUP conference in November of 2018. Namely, he would never ever accept a border in the Irish Sea, which is what he has promptly now done, which reminds us that it's not always wise to take the Prime Minister at his word. Now, I will give way.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. I wonder if he's read the government's own impact assessment on this bill, which says, and I quote at paragraph 241, goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland will be required to complete both import declarations and entry summary declarations, flatly contradicting what the Prime Minister has been saying.
Well, my right honourable friend makes an extremely powerful point. We have been told repeatedly, well, there will be no border in the Irish Sea. There is going to be a border in the Irish Sea, and that is going to have consequences for the way in which trade is conducted. It is also a gamble because of the clause in the bill which says that no minister is able to apply for an extension. Now, quite why the government needs to legislate to prevent something from happening, which is already made clear it has no intention of allowing to happen, namely an extension to the transition period, escapes me. But I would just gently point out to the House that the point of no return will be next June. Because under the withdrawal agreement, if a further extension hasn't been agreed between the parties by then, and the government is ruling it out, then there will be no possibility of extending the period. And I would say to the government, it will need to be really confident about how the negotiations are going by June of next year, which is not very far away, to be certain that it may not need that time, that additional time, to get what it wants. Now, there is no doubt that the Prime Minister is looking for a hard Brexit, because a free trade agreement of the type which he has put before the British people, and I grant him has won a mandate for, has already been assessed by this government as the second worst outcome for the economy after a no-deal Brexit. And it is extraordinary that we still do not have an economic assessment of the single most important decision that we are going to take, the nature of that future relationship, which has been presented before the House. Nothing. Silence. And I think history will record that was an act of irresponsibility. So I say to the House, and in particular to new members on all sides, who I congratulate on their election, that as these negotiations unfold, businesses that we represent will be coming to us because they will have issues they want to see raised in those negotiations, concerned about the outcome of those negotiations. And some of the things they're looking for will not be consistent with the policy that the government itself has set out, because this should not be about ideology. It is about the practical implications, having thrown away, because that's what Brexit does, the best trading relationship we have with any countries in the world. It is about what kind of new long-term arrangements which will be put in place, on which our jobs and our factories and our communities depend. And if the government gets it wrong, I just say it will not be a question of getting Brexit done. It will be a question of some industries being done over by Brexit. I will give way for the last time in view of the time.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and he's making such a powerful speech. Now, does he not agree with me that the great concern for this place has to be that we were promised to take back control? And the greatest deceit of all is the fact that there will be no scrutiny within this place of any element. And I must emphasise on the trade deals and just what sort of impact that's going to have on our economy.
Well, I agree with my honourable friend, and that is a matter for great regret. Now, the final point I want to make, Mr. Speaker, is that our leaving of the European Union will create great cheer on those benches, just as it will sadden many of us on this side of the House, because the divisions it has created will not easily be healed, because many people still think this is a terrible mistake that will weaken our economy and our influence in the world. In the modern age, it is how we use our sovereignty that will determine how well we can advance our interests and protect our citizens. And if we have learned anything from the events of recent times, if we're going to deal with the great challenges we face as a world, climate change, the movement of people around the globe, dealing with threats to peace and security, making sure the global economy works in the interests of all, we can only do that by working together. And we are about to walk away from one of the most important relationships that enables us to do that. And I say to the government, we will hold it to account as this process develops and unfolds.
Can I just appeal to members? If we all take 9 minutes, quite a few of you are not going to get in. So please, I've done the informal limit to give a bit of flexibility. Do not take advantage of members that come later. Damien Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I hope to give some time back to the House by being very brief, because all I want to do is to try and put today's debate and bill in its wider context, because it is so hugely important to the future of this country. And I simply want to make 2 points. The first of which is that those of us who voted for and campaigned for Remain should respect the result of the referendum. Some of us have tried to do that from straight afterwards, took the view that the British people had taken a decision and that those of us who are on the losing side of that argument should make the best of that, do what we regarded as the best for our country in the context of leaving. Sadly, many people on whose side I fought in that referendum campaign didn't take that decision and have spent the last 3.5 years trying to subvert that decision. And I have thought throughout that that was sadly the wrong course for them to take. And I think a lot of the problems that we've faced in politics in this country for the past few years stem from that wrong decision and the desire to continue fighting the last war. So to those of my friends on all sides of the House who up to now have not accepted the 2016 decision, I would appeal that now, after this general election result, please accept the decision. Please let's move on. Please accept that that game is over. One of my comrades in arms in that referendum, I will of course give way to her.
For giving way, but I do think that he's in danger of rewriting history. Those of us on this side of the House who wanted to go back to the people were not undermining democracy. More democracy doesn't undermine democracy, but I tell you what does undermine democracy, and that is a bill that is essentially an executive power grab, completely deleting all of the provisions that would have allowed for parliamentary scrutiny. Can he explain why, if he is standing up for democracy, he is happy to see a bill that is reducing democracy?
I don't agree with the Right Honourable Lady's analysis of this bill. But also, I would say to her, it is impossible to say you need a new referendum when we haven't implemented the results of the first referendum. I'm afraid that's been the central problem. And I would urge her and others to use all the energy and passion that she has at her disposal to help us as a country forge a new friendly relationship with our fellow democracies in the rest of Europe. They are neighbouring countries, they are friends, they are democracies. We should be able to establish a new and friendly relationship with them. And so that's my first point, is an appeal to those who campaign to Remain. The second is an appeal to all those on both sides of the argument, which is that we have to stop defining ourselves and each other simply as Remainers or Leavers. If we continue to define everyone purely by the way they voted in 2016, then we will never make progress as a parliament or as a country. The last few years have been miserable for democracy in this country. My attempt to be very brief is clearly being foiled, but yes, of course I'll give way.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I just ask the Right Honourable Gentleman whether he thinks that his party's conduct in the general election is consistent with the test he just set?
Yes, I do think that, and in a sense, it's less important that I think that than that quite clearly, looking at this House today, the British people think that. So I don't think that's a fruitful avenue for the Honourable Lady to pursue. But as I was saying, the last few years have been miserable for democracy in this country. And the more we hark back, the more we fight the old battles, the longer that misery will persist. So I hope that this bill, this debate, the fact that we will have left by the end of next month, means that members on both sides of the old European argument and all sides of this House take this chance to move on so that we can begin the healing process that this country desperately needs.
Just to remind, I'm going to have Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, and then coming over, then it will be a maiden speech with no interruptions. First of all, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We supported Brexit, and we want Brexit to happen, and we acknowledge and recognise that the government has won a mandate to take forward its withdrawal agreement. But there is a major contradiction at the heart of that agreement that causes us great concern. At the one level, the agreement does say that Northern Ireland should continue to have unfettered access to the rest of the UK for trade. But then we have customs arrangements that inhibit our ability to have that unfettered access. And that is our major concern, and one that we hope the government can address. The Prime Minister talks about taking back control, and that's what we want. And yet, for Northern Ireland, there is to be a new joint committee between the European Union and the United Kingdom, which will make major decisions about Northern Ireland. So, in a sense, shared control of Northern Ireland on key issues, and it is also the case that that arrangement cannot change unless the EU consents to change it, and therefore the EU has a veto over changing the arrangements under the control of that joint committee. So for Northern Ireland, taking back control is not quite taking back control. The European Union will continue to have a significant say in key matters relating to Northern Ireland.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. There's very clearly a number of issues that makes Northern Ireland less of a unionist region of the whole of the United Kingdom, than the very fact that the fishermen, whenever they leave Port of Bogey to go and fish and bring their fish back in, are subject to a tariff. The meat sector also will face tariffs as well. Does it not, the right honourable gentleman, not agree that what's going to happen here, as we in Northern Ireland will be less of a unionist than what they are in Liverpool, in Leicester, in Manchester, in Newcastle and in London, and we should be the same as everywhere else in the United Kingdom and not different?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that brings me to my second point, and the Prime Minister has been clear that he wants the United Kingdom to leave the European Union as one nation. And over the last few days he has spoken often of his one nation conservatism. And yet Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. And I want the Prime Minister to treat my part of the United Kingdom the same as the other parts in the context of leaving the European Union. So we want to hear from the government how they're going to achieve that when one considers the special provisions that have been made in this withdrawal agreement for Northern Ireland and the impact they will have and the way they will change the relationship between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. We welcome the fact that there is provision within the withdrawal agreement for the Assembly to have a say, but I'm not so sure that it's the same way, operates the same way as the Prime Minister described to the House earlier, where he said these special arrangements would only continue if the Assembly supported them. And yet I think it's the other way around. They will continue unless the Assembly stops them. And that requires a vote in the Assembly. The government will know that we have issues around how that vote is to be exercised and what it means for the principle of consent that is at the heart of the Belfast Agreement. And so we will want to continue our discussion with the government around how this will operate in practice. We do want the Assembly to have a say, but we want to ensure that that say can be exercised in a fair manner that respects the principle of consent as set out in the Belfast Agreement. And of course it's the case, Mr. Speaker, that we're looking towards the future relationship, and we hope that what is agreed in the future relationship will negate the need for many of the special arrangements that have been put in place for Northern Ireland. But again, the Joint Committee will have a say on that, and it is not a given, it is not certain that all of the future relationship arrangements will apply to Northern Ireland. And again, that's a continuing discussion that we want to have with the government, because we want Northern Ireland to benefit fully from the future relationship, from any free trade agreement that is arranged with the European Union. Notwithstanding, of course, that we have a land border with the European Union, that we have an agri-food sector that trades across that border. We recognise that arrangements have to be made to facilitate that ongoing trade. But what we don't want, Mr. Speaker, is barriers to trade with the rest of our own country. That is absolutely essential for us. And that brings me to my third point, Mr. Speaker, the customs arrangements. The Prime Minister has said that there will be no checks on goods going from Great Britain to Northern Ireland and from Northern Ireland to Great Britain. And as the Leader of the Opposition reminded us, there is a report from the Treasury that says very clearly there will be checks, and customs controls on goods travelling between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, in order to ensure that the correct tariffs are applied and that goods meet the EU standards. So it is clear that those checks will take place. So we want to work with the government to mitigate the impact on Northern Ireland business of the requirement for those checks. And again, that's something we want to hear more from the government on. We will be looking towards the committee stage, Mr Speaker, to see what we can do to reflect the commitment in the agreement and the commitment from the Prime Minister that there will be unfettered access between Northern Ireland and Great Britain in relation to trade. So, Mr Speaker, we would like to be in a position where we can support what is happening. But such is the gravity of our concern about the impact, the potential impact on our economy in Northern Ireland, and bear in mind, Mr Speaker, that economic prosperity goes hand in hand with political stability in Northern Ireland. The peace process can't be just about the politics of Northern Ireland. It has to be about prosperity for Northern Ireland as well. And the Prime Minister has said that he wants all of the United Kingdom to prosper. That has to include Northern Ireland, and we need to ensure that these arrangements work for Northern Ireland and don't become a barrier to trade between Northern Ireland and Great Britain.
Mr Speaker, I want to welcome you to your place. It's a delight to see you sitting there. And as many of us are talking about manifestos at the moment, I wish you well in delivering upon your manifesto commitments to stand up for backbenchers and to uphold democracy. And I know that you will discharge your duties with aplomb. I also want to place on record that this is my first contribution in this chamber since my promotion to the position of mum. I want to thank my honourable friend, the member for Wickham, who served as my proxy during my maternity leave, my wonderful staff and the Conservative Party for their support over the last 6 months. A general election wasn't necessarily part of the maternity leave plan, but baby Braverman threw himself into the campaign and I'm sure was critical in winning over some of those undecided voters. Trust, Mr Speaker. Can the people trust their politicians? Now that might seem like a trite question, but it's been a pertinent question in the context of Brexit. As the Prime Minister himself has said, that precious contract of trust between citizen and state, between voter and politician, has been stretched to breaking point over the last year. Pledges, promises, manifesto commitments have all evaporated in the face of an obstructionist parliament. That was a parliament where the majority of politicians thought they knew better than the majority of the British people. That was a parliament that wanted to stop Brexit and succeeded in doing so. That was a parliament that let our country down and in doing so broke faith with the British people. And let us not diminish the severity of that breach of trust, for it is only thanks to the trust that people place in us that we have even the right to step foot in this chamber. It is only at their behest that we serve. As the Prime Minister himself said, we are the servants and they are our masters. And I hope that we never ever forget that again. Mr Speaker, when I was serving as a Brexit Minister, I was responsible for the drafting of this bill. And I'm very glad to see that much of that work has survived, but that, of course, this new version reflects the changes secured by the Prime Minister in his renegotiated and new deal. This bill is of critical importance. It provides all the legal protections for the 3 million EU citizens. It provides the legal provisions for the implementation period, the financial settlement and the Northern Irish Protocol. And legally, formally and technically, it brings an end to our membership of the European Union. But I believe it's more fundamental for another reason. It's possibly the most important bill that this Parliament will consider because of trust. Because it is through the passage of this bill that we will begin the process of rebuilding trust with the British people. It is through the passage of this bill that we will honour that solemn vow that we made to get Brexit done. It is through the passage of this bill that we will take the first step outwards. And when we take the first step, we will do so confidently. Now, as the Prime Minister said during the course of the campaign, the first step is often the hardest. The first step has been difficult for our nation. It's been fraught with argument, indecision, doubt, and will be later than we anticipated. But when we take the first step through the enactment of this legislation, we will do so confidently and looking forward with optimism. We will do so in the knowledge that it is what millions of people around the country want us to do. We will do so knowing that it is born out of legitimacy and integrity, and that it derives from a noble aspiration for sovereignty and out of a heartfelt call for freedom, something that those members opposite who still live in denial about the referendum seek to deny. Mr. Speaker, historically and traditionally, the UK has been viewed around the world as a beacon of justice, a symbol of fair play, and the home of democracy. That has been called into question over the last year. This bill, and through its enactment, we will be able to reclaim our reputation as being the home of democracy, seize the opportunity to write our history of which our successors can be proud, and restore our credibility as a nation where people can trust their politicians and as a nation that doesn't break its promises.
Can I just remind people that we're now come to a maiden speech with no interruptions during the speech. Claire Hammer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This is my maiden speech. I anticipated a wee bit more time to craft something and to reflect our outlook, but put simply, Brexit is an emergency. I was elected to do all I can to mitigate the impact of Brexit for the people that I represent, and also, as a Northern Irish politician and a mum of three, the opportunity to speak for 5 minutes uninterrupted was too exciting to pass. I made it in this making the speech by some of the convention around your first opportunity to address the House, and I do want to take the opportunity to send my very best wishes to my predecessor, Emma Little Pengelly. It's fair to say we operated at opposite ends of the political spectrum, but I know that during her time in this House she operated with hard work and with diligence. It's also my great pleasure to be able to speak about my home, South Belfast, which is in very many respects an exemplar for what Northern Ireland can be and what indeed any community can be. It's diverse, it's well integrated, it's forward looking, and it's doing reasonably well economically. It's a place where difference is genuinely respected. We don't all have the same views in South Belfast, we don't all have the same vision for the future, but we do work the common ground, and I'm deeply grateful to all those in South Belfast who, in enormous numbers last week, elected me to serve them, and I will do my best to do that every day to encourage all that's good in our constituency and to shine a light on all that needs change. South Belfast, like Northern Ireland as a whole, is a place that did also overwhelmingly vote against Brexit. The pro-European majority of Northern Ireland members, I must tell you, is a more diverse and a more united political movement than I believe we've ever seen in our troubled history. For Northern Ireland in particular, Brexit has sharpened all of the lines that the Good Friday Agreement was designed to soften around identity, around borders, around sovereignty. We should have been spending the last few years talking about reconciliation, talking about regeneration, talking about social justice and equality. That's what all political action should really be about, but instead we've spent morning and noon and night talking about Brexit, a problem that didn't need to exist and which, particularly in Northern Ireland, reopens old wounds and which limits our horizons. Brexit sundered the body politic and the social consensus across these islands in unimaginable ways. It fed off people who did feel lost and disenfranchised in the political system, and I fear it will leave them feeling much worse. It's one of the reasons that Northern Ireland has now been without a government for over 1,000 days, leaving members like myself and the member for Foyle with no other forum through which to hold government to account. I believe that the government relied on that fatigue people had about Brexit, weary to get Brexit done without a meaningful debate about the decisions that are going to be required or the impact on our two islands and their intertwined futures. And I believe and I fear that eventually the political bluster of slogans is going to have to meet reality. I'm glad that due to the solidarity of the EU 27 and indeed members from across this House that there won't be in this withdrawal agreement a border in the island of Ireland, but I deeply regret that it creates an economic border in the Irish Sea. From the day and hour Brexit was conceived, it was very clear to many of us that wherever it landed, Brexit would create the borders of the past. And as those of us on the island of Ireland know, Brexit and borders have both a practical and symbolic significance. Make no mistake about it, there's no good way to do Brexit, but this version is markedly worse than its previous iterations. It creates barriers to trade and it introduces new levels of bureaucratic complexity. It is silent on workers' rights, it's silent on social justice and the rebalancing of the global economy. It will damage Britain's economy, it will cause significant collateral damage to Ireland North and South, it will further erode the resources available to public services already reeling from a decade of austerity, which has certainly, where I live and I suspect here too, decimated the health service, gripped working families and emboldened inequality. Beyond the economy, Brexit upends the delicate balance that in Northern Ireland has allowed us to imagine our shared and equal future together. We in Northern Ireland know the value of the EU, and as my political hero and predecessor in this House, John Hume, so often said, the EU is the greatest peace-building and conflict resolution project anywhere in the world, and those of us particularly affected by conflict have a duty to reflect its principles. I'm afraid the concerns we have been dismissed by those of you who won't ever have to live with the consequences of these actions. The cross-community and cross-party coalition of support in Northern Ireland that exists to maximise our access to the EU includes business, trade unions, agriculture, retail and most of civil society. And in fact, in that way, it mirrors the coalition of support for the Good Friday Agreement itself, which was actually inspired by and modelled on the EU's founding principles. It was about being able to compromise without losing your identity, without sacrificing your principle and without sacrificing your aspiration. The EU and the Good Friday Agreement neither are about nations and neither about territory. They're about relationships and about working together for the common good. They're about seeing challenges and finding solutions, but we know that the challenges of the present and the challenges of the next century are global. They're the climate emergency, they're tax justice, they're war, the humanitarian relief. They need international cooperation and solidarity. They need partnership. They don't need isolation and retreat. The world is getting smaller and our responses need to get bigger, and Brexit prevents young people from creating a world with a big horizon, and that's a generational injustice we're overseeing. Mr Speaker, we will vote against this narrow and restrictive view of the future articulated in this bill. We'll work with fair-minded people of all parties to limit by amendment the damage as best we can. We will seek to minimise the damage to the Good Friday Agreement, which for those of us in Northern Ireland is the only viable pathway to a better future under whichever constitutional future people desire that future. That agreement is at its core about relationships within three strands, relationships within Northern Ireland, between the north and south of Ireland and between our island and yours, and I deeply regret that Brexit in any form will damage each of those relationships in each of those strands, and I implore members of the House to work with us to limit that damage.
Owen Patterson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I congratulate you on resuming the chair and wish you the very best of luck in your office. Can I also heartily congratulate the new member for Belfast South on a very fine and fluent maiden speech. It's never easy to do a maiden speech. It's certainly not easy to do one after possibly 1 or 2 days having taken the oath. And also, this is a very high-profile debate, and she spoke clearly and put her point of view. And I also appreciate the manner in which she touched on her predecessor, Emma Little-Pengelly, with whom I had very good relations and probably more in common politically. Also, she could have touched on her predecessor but one, Alistair MacDonald from her own party, who I worked closely with as the shadow Secretary of State for 3 years, as the real Secretary of State for 2 years. And above all, I would heartily congratulate her for turning up. It is most important that her point of view for the future of Ireland is represented in this House. And through the most terrible years, and she quite rightly touched on John Hume, the SDLP bravely made their case of where they would like Ireland to go. They were looking to a united Ireland down the road, but they always turned up here. They always participated in local and national and multinational MEP European elections and participated fully in the democratic process. So I'm very pleased to see her and her colleague back. They won't be at all surprised that I don't agree with them, but we will be working together, I hope. And I really congratulate her on a fine speech at a very key moment. And I would just like to pick up some of the points she made. As you know, I don't entirely agree, as I see great future for Northern Ireland post-Brexit. She and I will entirely agree that there is never ever going to be a, quote, hard border. That is never ever going to happen, and there is no need. I've spent some time working on this last year, and I would like her to look at the concept of mutual enforcement, whereby we would recognise the standards required by the market into which we are selling, and we will make it a legal obligation to ensure that our suppliers match those, and in the same way those selling into Northern Ireland would also have to match those standards. So this would not breach the point of sovereignty, which is key to this debate. It will be entirely in our national hands, but we would respect those standards. And I think if she and her new colleague would like to look at that, we might find a mutually beneficial way forward. Because like her, one of my main worries about the bill is this concept of any sort of barrier down the Irish Sea, which is a clear breach of the Acts of Union, to be exact, Article 6, the Acts of Union of 1800, which said there were no taxes or barriers or impediments to trade between what was then Ireland and Great Britain. But many congratulations, and I look forward to working with her for the future. Mr. Speaker, I touched on the main central issue of this debate, which is democracy. We went through this endlessly in the last Parliament. Every week I'd come down here and I thought, it can't get worse, and it did. And it's very, very simple. David Cameron, in the 2015 election campaign, promised that if there's a Conservative majority, he would deliver an in-out, decisive referendum. The people would be given the power. They would decide. Whatever they decided, remain or leave, Parliament would honour. That was then endorsed throughout the referendum debates. It was made very clear by the then Foreign Secretary, who's now left the House, that this was decisive. We, the MPs, we are currently sovereign. We will give you, the people, the power to decide this issue. It was binary. There's no talk about trade deals. There's no talk about crashing out. It was remain or leave. That was then endorsed in the general election, when the two main parties got over 80% of the vote in 2017. Honourable Member for Maidenhead is not here today, actually got the second largest number of seats in British history until this recent election. But we had a further endorsement. The people were given another bite to try to get the message across, and that was the European elections this summer, in which, amazingly, the Conservative Party managed to come fifth behind the Greens, because our then withdrawal agreement was so unpalatable. So they've had a fourth bite, and I am very proud of those people. I'm very proud to represent them last week, 8 days ago, with the windscreen wipers on double wipe. There were queues in Oswestry in the rain, queues in Market Drayton. All my small villages, they all said, this is unprecedented. And I suppose about lunchtime, I think in fairness my wife got there first, we twigged. This was a rerun of the referendum. Those people had been abused, they'd been traduced, they'd been bombarded with propaganda leading up to the referendum, then after the referendum, and since then they were told they were thick, they were told they were racist. We in the RG were told we were fascists, we were Nazis, we were extremists. Yeah. And what did we want? All we wanted was to honour the referendum, the core of which is that laws in taxes imposed upon British citizens would be levied by democratically appointed politicians, elected politicians of this House. If they passed good laws, they'd be re-elected. If they passed fair taxes and spent the money well, they would be re-elected. If they didn't, they would be chucked out by the electors. A very, very simple principle which we have taught the world about for centuries. And that's what this is about. For those members, and it's staggering to hear them this morning, still quibbling, still cavilling about this. 4 times the people have spoken. How many more times do they have to speak to get it? They voted to leave. And this bill means they will leave. And I'm delighted for it. I've already touched, I'm going over my time, looking at the clock. Very, very briefly, I mentioned one issue. The Prime Minister gave me a splendid answer. I've touched on my fears on Northern Ireland. I would just very quickly like to mention fish and reiterate that in 2005, the Centre Party fought an election on my Green Paper, which established that the common fisheries policy is a biological, environmental, economic, social disaster, and we need to replace it. We need to take back complete control of the EEZ and all our resources, and then on an annual basis, in an amicable manner like other maritime nations, negotiate reciprocal deals on quota. And that is the way ahead. But this is a day for democracy. No others want to speak. We are delivering what the people wanted 4 times, and I'm delighted to support the bill.
Matthew Pettigrew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I intend to be as brief as I possibly can today, not least because the bill before us is, in essence, that which we debated in principle back in October. I also don't intend to delve into the various ways the government have revised the legislation and abandoned their previous commitments on workers' rights, on parliamentary scrutiny and oversight, and on child refugees. There will be time enough for those changes to be debated in committee stage. I want to focus my brief remarks on the purpose and intent of the deal this legislation will give effect to. Mr. Speaker, there is no question it did its job, but after the 31st of January, the slogan "Get Brexit Done" will be exposed as the fiction it is. Because when this bill becomes law, as it will not mean that Brexit is done, and every single honourable and right honourable member on the benches opposite who parroted that line during the recent election campaign knows full well that is the case. Brexit is a process, not an act, and the passage of this legislation and the full implementation of the agreement by both parties is only the end of the beginning of that process and a prelude to a far more challenging phase of it. In that next phase, the threat of a no-deal cliff edge will remain a distinct possibility. But it's not inevitable. There is, in my view, no chance that a comprehensive partnership will be concluded before the end of the transition period in December, but there is a chance that a free trade agreement can be concluded in that time. All it will require, of course, is a multitude of concessions from the government, concessions that the Prime Minister will no doubt dress up as victories, just as he did with all those concessions he made to secure his deal in October. But the reason why I don't rule out the possibility that a trade deal might be secured in less than 12 months exposes precisely the kind of agreement the government are aiming for. So set aside the very serious implications of this deal for Northern Ireland, for the constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom. The deal struck in October was the product of a conscious political decision on the part of this government to break with the approach of its predecessor and to abandon the possibility, and it was only ever a possibility, not a guarantee, of a trading relationship premised on a close alignment with the EU in favour of guaranteeing a more distant one. Now, ministers are apt to label their objective for the future economic relationship as a best-in-class free trade deal. That phrase is entirely meaningless. What the deal the legislation before us seeks to give effect to is one that will set us on a path toward, at best, I fear, the most basic form of free trade agreement possible, one likely to be focused only on tariffs and quotas in goods trade, and one that will therefore necessarily involve only minimal coverage of services and significant non-tariff barriers on trade. As my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, alluded to in his remarks, voting for this legislation today will leave the door open for the hardest form of Brexit possible, short of leaving the EU without an agreement at all. A Brexit that will entail a decisive break with the EU's single market, its customs union, the judicial framework and regulations, and one that the government's own economic analysis makes clear, not of this deal, but of previous deals, will have a profoundly negative impact for our economy for years to come. We may not feel those economic consequences immediately. Indeed, there's every chance we see a surge in investment in the months ahead. But the harm, discernible or not to those it will impact on, will be felt and will take its toll in every constituency and every community across these isles over the coming decades. I do not believe that a Brexit of the kind this legislation will facilitate is the right way forward for our country or for those I represent. Indeed, I believe it's a profound error. Now, each of those members here today who share that view, indeed each of us who served in the last Parliament, will no doubt continue to question whether we could have done more to avert this outcome. But those of us who returned last week have a chance today to signal our clear opposition to it and to ensure that the deal before us and its consequences are wholly owned by the party opposite. Mr. Speaker, the deal before us was a bad deal for our country in October when the Prime Minister agreed to it. It remains a bad deal today, and I'm afraid the scale of the government's victory last week has done nothing to alter that fact or my very firm conviction that the right thing to do today is to vote against it in principle.
Rachel McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for calling me so early to speak in this debate.
Don't get too used to it.
Well, I was just congratulating myself on putting my tick in the right box to vote for you. It is indeed wonderful to see you in the chair, and congratulations on your election. And I do hope this ushers in the start of a brave new Parliament, not just for me, myself and my speaking, but of course for all of us and for the country, Mr. Speaker. Now, in the general election that took place only just over a week ago, which seems incredible, I was returned to this place with over 63% of the vote. And that's the highest share of the vote ever received in the fantastic constituency of Redditch since its formation in 1997, exceeding even Jackie Smith, the former Labour Home Secretary's vote share when she ably represented the constituency. So I think, members of the House, that represents an overwhelming mandate for me to get Brexit done and move on to the priorities that my constituents want me to focus on behalf of them, which of course is returning services to the Alex Hospital. New members, you will hear this again. Hints, hints. So, Mr. Speaker, along with my colleagues who were elected in 2017, I think it's fair to say we've had a pretty miserable time of it. We all came in full of the passion that my wonderful new colleagues sitting here, I can see that they are full of, eager to do our best, not just for our constituents, but for the whole country. And we haven't been able to fulfil what we were sent to Parliament to do. I believe, as a member with the privilege to sit on these benches, I am a servant of my constituents. It is not my job to tell my constituents that they were wrong, that they didn't know what they were voting for. I voted Remain, Mr. Speaker, but at the end of the day, we have to respect democracy, and people who are on the wrong side of arguments just need to move on. And finally, we have a chance to do that. I must admit, Mr. Speaker, when the Prime Minister set out on his path of firstly trying to reopen the withdrawal agreement and get rid of the backstop and then go for a general election, I thought to myself, he's got an uphill struggle in front of him, and I really wondered whether he would be able to do that with the state of the Parliament that we had at that time. But I think that what the Prime Minister has done is take a leaf out of the British Army Engineers book. They have a saying, when faced with a seemingly unsurmountable challenge, we will get it done, whether it can be done or not. And, Mr. Speaker, I think that is what the Prime Minister has done, and I want to thank him for returning all of us here, for breaking the deadlock and allowing us to do our jobs of serving the people. We have a refreshed Parliament. We have a new intake who are full of passion and energy and ideas to transform our whole country. And we can finally do that. I can think of no better way to finish this brief session of Parliament than by wishing everybody a very, very Merry Christmas, including yourself, Mr. Speaker, including the clerks in the House, including all the doorkeepers who've worked so hard to make us all feel welcome, all the staff who have helped. I know what it was like. It was only 2 years ago when I was here, how confusing it was. They are so patient and so lovely, and I will definitely be voting in the I lobby for this bill, in case anyone was in any doubt at all, to honour my constituents' democratic wishes, the lovely people of Redditch who put me here, and I want to wish everybody a very Merry Brexmas.
Very good. Catherine McKinnell.
Yeah. During this election, I spoke to so many voters and fully appreciated the desire expressed by some, whether they voted Leave or Remain, to get closure on the issue of Brexit. It was very clever electioneering to paint the impression that this is simply a small foreign policy issue that can be wrapped up relatively quickly so that ministers can get on with the bread and butter domestic issues. However, we are no longer electioneering. It's time for reality to bite. And the reality is that this bill is just the start of years of uncertainty about our future. And rather than getting Brexit done, it is getting Brexit begun. There are still so many issues to be resolved, incredibly thorny issues. The most fundamental question of whether securing a US or an EU trade deal is the most important to this government. Both will want some sort of regulatory alignment, and the Prime Minister needs to decide what he is prepared to concede on food, fisheries, labour and environmental provisions, just for starters. The government must also decide what kind of say, if any, devolved governments are going to have on trade agreements. If the Scottish Government is excluded from negotiations, what does this mean for our union? We've already seen and heard expressed the challenges posed for Northern Ireland by the proposals for the Irish Sea border, something that the former Prime Minister promised not to do. And I asked some time ago, immediately after the 2016 referendum, what the government was going to do to ensure that regional voices and concerns are heard as part of this Brexit negotiations. The answer I got from the Prime Minister then was nothing. I have little hope that the answer will be any more encouraging today. And there are some really big questions. And then that's not even to mention the long-term tariffs, access to labour market, the state aid regime, access to fishing waters, regulations across the whole economy, but particularly in food, the priority given to sections such as farming, financial services, automotive, environment and labour policy, data flows, privacy issues, intellectual property and access to diverse EU regulatory programmes, and much, much more. And the Prime Minister has committed to do all of this in just 12 months, or risk another no-deal cliff edge. And just as the election doesn't change the fact that Brexit is going to continue to dominate our politics for some time to come, it also does not change the economic reality of Brexit. The Chancellor flatly refused to publish any Treasury analysis of the Prime Minister's deal when I wrote to him in my then capacity as interim chair of the Treasury Committee prior to the election. He also refused to appear nor send any minister to appear in front of the committee. It's also difficult to see how the kind of Brexit that the Prime Minister wants to pursue is in any way compatible with the wider promises made by the Conservatives during their general election campaign. The government says it's committed to increasing public spending, or at least on the NHS, education and police, whilst also keeping tax, national insurance and VAT either flat or falling, and reducing debt as a proportion of GDP over the course of this Parliament. What choices the government makes and what promises it breaks all remain to be seen. But I wanted to say as well that I am truly sorry that despite parties offering a final say on any Brexit deal winning 53% of the vote in the general election, and all the public polling indicating that the majority of the British public think it was wrong to vote to leave the EU back in 2016, that the voting public will not get to have their say on the final Brexit deal. And indeed that's precisely why the Prime Minister wanted a Brexit general election rather than a confirmatory referendum, despite getting a Withdrawal Act through Parliament on its first reading at its last attempt before Parliament was dissolved. But we are where we are, as they say. and the makeup of this Parliament has changed dramatically, and we will now be leaving the EU at the end of January. But the anxieties of the people we represent in the North East on what Brexit means for their jobs, for their livelihoods, have not changed. The analysis showing the North East will be hit hardest of all has not changed, nor has the threat Brexit poses to the 63% of North East exporters who rely on access to EU markets. Brexit isn't going to be done. The challenges of the next stage are infinitely more complex than the first, and so I will continue to represent the views, the anxieties and the interests of the people that I represent here in Parliament, and hold this government to account on this monumental change for this country, which I fear many will come to regret.
Just before we proceed, could I remind the House again that Mr. Speaker has sought to impose a voluntary 6-minute time limit. Stephen Craig.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the member for Newcastle North, and it's a pleasure to be here to hear some really excellent debates already, and most notably the maiden speech for the member for Belfast South, and it was a pleasure to hear the speech from my honourable friend, the member for Fareham, who spoke powerfully about the issue of trust. In a sense, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we're ending this year very much as we started 2019, with a debate and a vote on an EU withdrawal agreement. And again today, as I did in January, I will be voting in support of that withdrawal agreement because, first and foremost, I'm a Democrat. I believe in honouring the outcome of the 2016 referendum, and I will support measures to take the United Kingdom out of the EU. But I also believe, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that how we leave the EU really matters. I believe in an orderly exit, and I've been consistent in my support and preference for leaving with a deal, and we have what I think is an eminently supportable deal in front of us. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we're also ending this year, I think, actually in a very different place from where we started. All week there's been a sense of a fresh start around Westminster, a page being turned, and I appreciate that that feeling might not be felt equally on both sides of the chamber, but I hope for the whole House of Commons this will be a fresh start, with a new, fresh sense of purpose and direction, because that's what I believe that voters last week put us here to bring, a fresh sense of purpose and direction. And voting for this bill this afternoon, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I believe will send a very powerful signal back to the British public, back to our voters, that we've heard their message, that we are bringing that sense of direction and purpose. Because, make no mistake about it, for those of you who weren't here in this House during the course of this year, 2019 has been a year of sclerosis. We took the British public on a Brexit journey, a tortuous journey, of suffocating delays, endless debates, repetitious debates, votes that took us nowhere. There was no substantial outcome from all of the hours that we spent in this chamber on this very subject. And the British public turned out at polling stations a week ago to give us their verdict on that. And very quietly and very firmly they said, enough now. It's time for action and it's time for decision. And we have a government that's been put here to take this legislation through, to take us out of the EU in an orderly and responsible way. We have tested the patience of the British public quite enough. They send us here to do a job. Yes, they expect us to scrutinise. They expect us to ask the difficult, challenging questions of government, even our own ministers on our own side. They expect us to work hard at that. But they don't expect us to come here and wilfully block a democratic mandate that they give, as they did in the 2016 referendum. I'll give way once, yes.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. Can I just point out, because I know it hasn't been said very much in the last Parliament, the people of Northern Ireland voted to remain, and in every election since, they have reasserted their rejection of Brexit. So when we're talking from the other benches about one nation and all of that, can they recognise that Northern Ireland and Scotland have once again very loudly rejected this Brexit and every other kind of Brexit you could possibly come up with?
So I thank the honourable member for that intervention. In fact, I was going to come on to make precisely the point that, as well as being a Democrat, I'm also a unionist. And the election results in Northern Ireland and in Scotland, reaffirming the outcome of the referendum votes there, present a challenge to us in government about how we take forward Brexit. And I am satisfied that we are dealing with Northern Ireland in a very sensitive way. I think we've got work to do in how we address the issue for Scotland. But coming back to the point that I was making, we are sent here to do a job. Voters, our members of the public, don't expect us to block democracy. They don't expect us to see their members of Parliament coming here trying to find and use every trick in the book to block Brexit, which is precisely what happened during 2006, during 2019. Members of Parliament going to their constituencies at the weekend, telling their Leave voters on a Saturday that they really wanted to get on with Brexit. They really, really wanted to get on with Brexit. And then coming back here on a Monday morning and literally finding and using every trick in the book to block Brexit. So I'm very clear, Mr Deputy Speaker, that I've been put here to do a job by the constituents of Preseli Pembrokeshire, and that is to pass this bill this afternoon as a really significant first positive step forward to implementing the outcome of the 2016 referendum. To vote against it, Mr Deputy Speaker, I believe would be a vote for continuing all of what we saw during 2019. A continuation of 2019, like a winter that never ends, but it's never Christmas, Mr Deputy Speaker. So my appeal to colleagues on all sides is to get behind this bill and let's show the country that this new House of Commons has got a real sense of direction and purpose for the whole United Kingdom.
Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm a first-generation European migrant. I came here in 1990 and the passport I was holding was not an issue. I was welcomed and allowed to thrive. Our 4 children were born here and brought up here. I worked as a teacher and paid my taxes. I was, like millions of EU citizens, a part of British society. I became a councillor where my residents first thought me a bit different, but soon accepted that my background didn't matter, but that I represented them well. I became a British citizen and stood for Parliament. Then came Brexit. EU citizens became the centre of a cynical political ploy to divert attention from the failure to invest in public services and pin blame on EU migration. Suddenly I was wondering, am I not welcome here? Do they mean me? And if they not mean me, who do they mean? My wonderful electorate in Bath has always looked beyond my background and has just re-elected me with a huge majority. And I feel truly humbled. But Bath is special. The relentless rhetoric and hostile environment created around EU free movement has wounded EU citizens to the core. The government's newly found but false words about our European friends are failing to repair the damage. EU citizens have understood that this Tory government does mean them and they are leaving. No smooth words can easily heal the deep wounds that have been created here and abroad. I feel different about this country now than when I first arrived, and so do millions of true Brits who, like me, are grieving about Britain's lost soul. Its shift towards small-minded nationalism. They're embarrassed by the mean and self-centred political class and its timid retreat behind its own borders. We have talked a lot about democracy, not just here. The election has produced a result. We will leave the EU at the end of January. My party and I fought hard and we fought well. All through the last Parliament, with only a handful of MPs, we stood up for nearly half of all people in this country who did not want to leave. We demanded a people's vote, which was obstinately denied us by the Tories, but brought thousands upon thousands of like-minded citizens on our streets. That is democracy too. In a democracy, a ruling... I've said no. I've said no. In a democracy, a ruling party needs a functioning opposition. Indeed, without opposition, democracy is dead. My passionate belief that the UK is better off as a proud member inside the EU than an irrelevant outsider has not melted away overnight. I will not cease to voice this opinion here and outside Parliament. That is my democratic right, and whoever is trying to deny me or anybody else that democratic right is the anti-democrat, not me. But I understand that now the battle to stop Brexit is over. For me, we don't only leave the EU, for me we leave an ideal that I had of this country. I was brought up in post-war Germany, a country that was recovering from the ravages of a brutal dictatorship. Britain was the beacon of democracy, liberal values and the respect for every human life. British people then had the guts to find inhumanity, brutality and illiberalism. The mission to bring functioning democracies based on human rights, civil liberties and the rule of law to the rest of the world has been a historic British mission. Britain, in its long history, has always been global, internationalist, outward-looking and inclusive. Britain understood that its international interest was tightly woven into the interest of countries around them. By saying goodbye to the EU, we say goodbye to those uniquely British political instincts and values. I and my Liberal Democrats will vote against this withdrawal agreement because we believe it to be damaging to our economy, our security, our international reputation, our ability to tackle the global climate emergency, and it will put a border in the Irish Sea and threaten our family of nations. But most of all, we will lose something profoundly British, to be international and leading in the continuous fight for liberal values, human rights and a rules-based international orders. We Liberal Democrats will always fight for that. Thank you.
Sir William Cash.
Thank you. I am bound to say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that listening to what I just heard is a complete inversion of what leaving the European Union is all about. The European Union is utterly undemocratic. The EU makes its laws, and I speak as a person who has been chairman of the European Scrutiny Committee for 10 years, and I have been on the committee for 34 years. I know a tiny bit about what's been going on. The reality is that the legislation is made in the Council of Ministers behind closed doors by majority vote of other countries over us, and in addition to that, normally made by consensus without even a transcript. Fortunately, the people of this country will be able to hear and see what is done in this chamber today, which you certainly can't do in the Council of Ministers. It is a complete travesty to suggest that in some shape or another we are Little Englanders or nationalistic. We are nothing of the kind. This, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is a watershed moment in our history. This bill will go down in history when it is enacted in conjunction with the Withdrawal Act of 2018, which repeals the European Communities Act 1972 and takes us out of the subjugation and the shackles of our being able to govern ourselves and having the rules imposed upon us by other member states. It is about lawmaking. That is why we are returned to this House. This is why, by the free choice of the people of this country, and I congratulate them with every fibre of my being for making the decision by such an emphatic decision a few days ago. The reality is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that this is a historic moment. It compares to the decision that was taken when, in 1660, the Cromwellian period was redefined. We came back into parliamentary government. We re-established parliamentary government in 1688, and then there were the Corn Laws. There was the giving of the right to the British people, the working man, to be able to vote in 1867. And then in May 1940, we decided that we would not be governed by any other country, and we defeated Hitler, and we made it clear that we were going to be a self-governing nation. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Will he acknowledge that there are hundreds of thousands of EU citizens in this country, people like me who have come from Europe to settle in this country, who voted for Brexit and believe in Brexit. And unlike the honourable lady from the Lib Dem benches who seeks to somehow represent all of these EU citizens, there are hundreds of thousands of us who stand by that decision and are proud of the decision that this country has taken to regain her sovereignty.
I absolutely agree with every word my honourable friend has said. For me, Mr Deputy Speaker, this has been a long journey. My first amendment on the question of sovereignty was in June 1986 during the Single European Act. I wasn't even allowed to debate it. I was cut off the knees by one of your predecessors for daring to suggest that it should be debated. The fact is that then we moved on to the Maastricht Treaty, and I had the honour and the privilege to help to run and to lead that rebellion because it was needed to stop European government, which is what that treaty was all about. Then we moved on to Nice, Amsterdam, and then Lisbon. And I look around, survey the landscape of this enormous change that's now taking place today. And I see exhausted volcanoes of former prime ministers who've been constantly on the media telling us that we got Brexit wrong. No, we did not. And furthermore, Mr Deputy Speaker, not only did we get it right, the British people absolutely 100% know that this is one of the great moments in British history. We have been shackled by the European Union. Yes, we will continue to trade with the European Union. Yes, we will have global trading. Yes, we will have our democracy and our sovereignty back. This is a great moment in our history, and I can only say that as far as I am concerned, one of the most important two clauses in this bill are clauses 29 and 38, one of which gives the right of the European Scrutiny Committee to determine whether or not the matters of national vital interest need to be protected from legislation which during the transitional period may well be brought in against us by the European Union from behind closed doors, as in the case of the ports regulation, for example, only a few years ago, which was objected to and was absolutely resisted, not only by the members of the committee, but also by all the trade unions and also all the port employers. Yet it was imposed upon us. And by the members, the former minister says, and by him as well. We were overridden. This Parliament was treated with contempt, despite the fact that we were completely against this ports regulation. So the other clause is the one which relates to parliamentary sovereignty. And I am glad to note that the wording in that clause is identical to the wording in certain respects that I put forward in June 1986. Perhaps that long journey has been proved to be worthwhile. So I congratulate the Prime Minister on what he has achieved. And above all else, I congratulate the voters of this country, particularly those in Labour seats. I was brought up in Sheffield. I saw the destruction of the steel industry. I saw the destruction of the coal industry. Yeah, I saw it. No, it was done. No, it was done. Look, I'm not going to take any lessons from the gentleman on the front bench. I voted against the closure of the coal pits. I was one of the very few people. I'm just telling you that it was the European coal steel community that was at the root of the problem, and the people as a chairman, as a vice chairman of the coal communities all-party group, I can tell you, I worked with Labour members of Parliament on these questions.
The honourable gentleman is a very experienced parliamentarian. He knows he should address the chair and not individual members. And while I'm on my feet, I'm looking at the clock as well. Sir William Cash.
Indeed, I'm grateful for that comment because I agree with it. But I will say this, with every fibre of my being, the European Union has done no good to this country. We run a massive deficit. And we run a surplus with the rest of the world. We have now regained, by this bill, when enacted, The right to govern ourselves is about democracy and it's about trust. And that is something which is so precious, people fought and died for it.
It's now a privilege to invite the new member for North Down to make his maiden speech, Mr. Stephen Farry.
Gora, my ugat, last Cancora. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I wanted my first formal comments in this chamber to be in Irish to reflect the shared heritage of the language across all of the traditions in Northern Ireland. I'm also very pleased to be here as a representative of the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland, and indeed being the second member of my party to be elected following in the footsteps of my party leader, Naomi Long, who was elected back in 2010, and also to make reference to Stratton Mills, who sat here for about a year as an Alliance member back in the early 70s, a member for North Belfast. Before making comments on the second reading itself, I do want to make reference and pay tribute to my predecessor, Lady Herbin. She was a very diligent member over 18 years and conducted herself with tremendous integrity. And in particular, in recent years, she was very dogged in standing up for Northern Ireland, and in particular for protecting the Good Friday Agreement in the context of Brexit. I come to this House as someone who has a very strong mandate for Remain. And indeed, the Remain vote in Northern Ireland grew in the most recent election that brought us here. So Remain is strong and continues to be strong and to reflect the dominant majority of the people in that region. Therefore, I will be voting against this bill in terms of the second reading, to honour the wishes of the people who sent me here and the people of Northern Ireland. There is no such thing as a good or sensible Brexit, whether we're talking about the UK or in particular for Northern Ireland. But following on from some of the previous comments, it is worth stressing that the House is potentially poised today to consciously vote to make the UK worse off economically. We are aware that that is what we are doing, and that, I think, is an incredible thing, incredible situation that the House finds itself in. The European Union represents perhaps the single greatest example of economic integration anywhere in the world, and we're walking away from that. And there does seem to be this false choice between working in the context of the European Union or the concept of pursuing a global Britain. We can expand our trade and our economy best through working through the European Union, where we have the strength of numbers to stand up and get better deals with the likes of the United States, Australia and China. That is in our self-interests. It's also important to bear in mind that the European Union is more than simply an economic body. It is more than the sum of its parts, and it allows effective and collective responses to global challenges, including migration, global poverty, and, most critically in terms of the current agenda, tackling climate change. In terms of Northern Ireland itself, our society only works based upon sharing and interdependence. Sadly, we continue to be a divided society. We are a complex society with a lot of ambiguities. The Good Friday Agreement balanced all of those different challenges through the unique set of relationships. So it is the principle of consent, but it's more than that. It is the internal dynamics, it's the north-south relationship, and it's also the east-west relationship. In terms of our economy, in terms of both supply chains and trade, we depend both on north-south and east-west linkages. The challenge of Brexit is that if we don't go for a soft Brexit, as defined by the UK staying inside the customs union and the single market, then we are facing a situation where Northern Ireland will be confronted with some form of border, boundary, interface and a degree of friction. And that is a very regrettable situation. Any perception of a border creates the feeling of winners and losers. And in the context of a place like Northern Ireland, where we are inching slowly towards a better, more reconciled and integrated society, that has the potential to be very damaging and indeed destructive. The deal that was negotiated by the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, I think, was a better attempt at a soft landing than the current deal negotiated by the current Prime Minister. Indeed, the previous deal had the pragmatic support of the Northern Ireland business community, an unprecedented level of commitment from them in terms of what can be viewed as a rather contentious political issue. But they understood that it was a genuine attempt to address the issues. The current proposal from the Prime Minister is a much more challenging situation for Northern Ireland. And while it does certainly maintain an open border on the island itself, it does create a much more problematic situation down the Irish Sea than people had a right to expect and was originally anticipated. To be clear, some degree of checks down the Irish Sea can be managed. Indeed, there are already precedents in that regard, and Northern Ireland has always done things differently since the early 1920s. Nor do I see the notion of any sort of special deal for Northern Ireland or an interface as being a constitutional question. But what has been put down so far is going to be very challenging in terms of our economy, particularly in terms of the East-West interface, but also the West-East exchange as well. Some estimates are putting the compliance costs as high as potentially £300 million per year for our businesses. That simply can't be sustained. So rather than Northern Ireland having a foot in both camps, Northern Ireland risks becoming peripheral. The Prime Minister, throughout the election campaign, has been very clear that there will be no checks down the Irish Sea. That's clearly at odds with the view of most experts and most people who have looked and analysed the deal so far. There are some common grounds across all the parties from Northern Ireland. I'm coming clearly from a Remain perspective. My counterparts in the DUP are coming from a Leave perspective. My colleagues in the SDLP are also coming from a Remain perspective. But together, I think we have a reasonable argument, and we speak with a moral authority about trying to mitigate the impact of that boundary down the Irish Sea. At the very least, we would ask that the Prime Minister and Government would meet us halfway in that regard. Much has been made of the comment from the Prime Minister about being a one-nation Conservative. Now, unlike my counterparts in the DUP, I don't interpret that comment as meaning one nation for the UK. The UK is about 4 different nations. So my appeal to the Prime Minister is to don't be a one-nation Prime Minister for England, but be a Prime Minister for all 4 nations of the UK, and in particular, as we proceed into more detailed scrutiny of this bill, to pay very particular attention to the needs of Northern Ireland and the damaging implications of what is now set to emerge in terms of that interface down the Irish Sea. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Mr Nigel Evans.
Well, very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I first start by congratulating the Honourable Member for North Down on an excellent and accomplished maiden speech, and also the Honourable Lady for Belfast South as well, who gave an excellent maiden speech again, distinctive in her own style. It's incredibly stressful giving a maiden speech. I remember back to mine over 27 years ago. I'm sure you remember it, Sir Roger. It took place at 1:10 in the morning, and it was on the subject of the Maastricht Treaty. Tristan Garrell-Jones was sitting where our wonderful Brexit Minister is sitting now, and it was truly the most awful speech I think I have given in the chamber to date. Anyway, it was truly awful. I remember reflecting back and I looked at it, and all it was saying how wonderful the Maastricht Treaty was because it didn't contain this and it didn't contain that. But when I look back on, let's say, 1975, when we had the referendum that Harold Wilson set up to get himself out of a pickle, I probably would have voted to have stayed in the common market, because I thought the common market was a good thing. But the first piece of legislation, the Maastricht Treaty, was part of the salami slicing of powers away from this wonderful institution, the mother of all parliaments at Westminster, and giving it to Brussels, and I didn't want that. And so when David Cameron announced that we were going to have a referendum on staying in or leaving the European Union, I sat down and I thought, now, which side am I going to go on? Well, that internal mental debate lasted about a nanosecond, and I thought, it's time to leave. And I know I'm really grateful to members opposite for informing me since 2016 why I did vote to leave, and indeed why my constituents voted to leave and why the country voted to leave. But I really don't need any help, because I know why I voted to leave, and it wasn't to make my country poorer. No, it wasn't that. It wasn't to increase unemployment, it wasn't to do that. But it was in order, call me old-fashioned, that all the legislation that pertains to this country is actually made in this Parliament. And that if the people of Great Britain don't like what the government is doing, they can kick us out. That's democracy. And so when I stood on the A59 on the 23rd of June with some Leave banners, inhaling all the lead from the passing lorries who tooted madly when they saw the signs, I knew that we were making history on that day. And then sadly, of course, when we got back here, all the excitement of we're leaving, then all of a sudden, the sclerosis came in, the paralysis came in. And at one stage, I thought the best we could hope for was Brexit in name only, that we'd be in some form of customs union. That's not Brexit. That we'd be justiciable by the European courts. That's not Brexit. That we'd have to pay in money to access their single market. That's not Brexit. I know why people voted to leave the European Union, and it wasn't Brexit in name only. It was that when we leave on the 31st of January, we are then a third country, and then when we have left the implementation period at the end of 2020, Great Britain, the United Kingdom of Northern Ireland and Great Britain, will be an independent country again. We can start to look forward to the future with such optimism, which is displayed by the Prime Minister every time he comes to the dispatch box. There is a positivity and an energy about him and about our country, because despite the referendum campaign, which told us that unemployment would go up, that there would be an immediate recession, and it would be a disaster for the United Kingdom if we voted to leave, the British people, the plucky British people, decided not to listen to the gloom and doom. They decided that they knew better about their country. And so I look forward to those trade deals with the European Union, with the United States of America, with the vast majority of countries who seem to manage somehow or other operating outside of the European Union. And I think we've got an incredibly great future for our country. And on that note, Sir Roger, can I wish all members on all sides, because it's only been a week since we were re-elected, and it was a gruelling campaign, let's be fair, I've still got frostbite. I just want to wish all members here and all the staff that look after us a very Merry Christmas and a happy 2020 with an independent United Kingdom.
Yeah. Stephen Tibbs.
Mr Deputy Speaker, and I echo the final sentence of the Honourable Member for Ribble Valley, but not very much else.
Right.
The Prime Minister was understandably very anxious to hold the general election before this bill was scrutinised. And as we go through the bill in detail, the impact of his agreement on the UK is going to become apparent. And the agreement is going to do a lot of damage to our constitution and to our economy. And members opposite are going to have a lot of explaining to do to their constituents as those impacts become apparent in the years ahead. I just want to raise 2 points, Sir Roger, in this debate. Firstly, to deal quite briefly with an important subject I raised with the Prime Minister in the House on the 19th of October. I asked him if he understood the worries of manufacturing exporters set out by their organisation, Make UK, about new rules of origin checks and other red tape his deal will impose upon them. The Prime Minister, in answering my question, said, and I quote, "The reason I'm not worried about that is that there are no new rules of origin checks." But that is not what his deal says. Paragraph 22 of the political declaration, which he negotiated, refers to, and I quote, "appropriate and modern accompanying rules of origin" for the proposed free trade agreement, in direct contradiction to what the Prime Minister said in the Chamber. And of course the reality is that there will have to be rules of origin checks to stop products from countries outside Europe entering the European Union via a UK free trade agreement. But secondly, I want to talk about a subject which we've aired already in this debate, where again the statements of the Prime Minister contradict directly the agreement he has negotiated. In the withdrawal agreement, in the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland, Article 5(4) of that says, and I quote, "The provisions of Union law listed in Annex 2 to this protocol shall also apply in respect of Northern Ireland." Now, Annex 2 comprises 34 pages, and it lists what I count as being 287 separate items of EU law, which will continue to apply in Northern Ireland, but not in the rest of the UK. The Honourable Member for Ribble Valley was celebrating exiting the customs union. Of course, Northern Ireland will not exit the customs union. But the first of those 287 items of EU law is the European Union Customs Code, which will continue to apply in Northern Ireland after the UK has left the EU. And that is going to have very far-reaching consequences for Northern Ireland. And I pay tribute to the maiden speeches we've heard from the Honourable Member for North Down and also the Honourable Member for Belfast South, both fine speeches highlighting some of these issues. I quoted in an earlier intervention what the government's own impact assessment says. Paragraph 241, I'm going to read it again. Goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland will be required to complete both import declarations and entry summary declarations because, this is the government's own impact assessment, because the UK will be applying the EU's Union Customs Code in Northern Ireland. So, yes, I'll gladly give way.
I really appreciate the honourable friend for giving way. The issues that he has identified, does he agree with me that it clearly indicates that any business in Northern Ireland, and remember 70% of our trade is done with the rest of the United Kingdom, that the codes that he is reading out put a significant burden on doing business from Northern Ireland with the rest of our own nation, and that should really be changed if this is to go ahead.
Well, it undoubtedly does, but it's kind of hardwired into this deal that the Prime Minister has done. So what the Prime Minister means in claiming there will be no checks across the Irish Sea is frankly anybody's guess. Just read the government's own documents. The Prime Minister's statement is quite clearly untrue. The Treasury presentation on the Northern Ireland Protocol that we've been reminded of already makes the position clear. I'm going to quote it. At a minimum, it says this means that export summary declarations will be required when goods are exported from Northern Ireland to Great Britain in order to meet the EU's obligations under the SAFE framework. And it goes on in a slide in that presentation headed Economic Impact on Northern Ireland, and I quote again, customs declaration and documentation and physical checks on West-East and East-West trade will be highly disruptive to the Northern Ireland economy. That is the truth about where we are heading. There will be major damage to the union between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, and I must say it is one of the ironies of this. It has been directly facilitated by the party in this House whose raison d'etre is maintaining the union. So, Roger, the agreement being implemented in this bill will damage the UK. It will put the continued existence of the UK in its current form at risk, and it's going to damage the UK economy. I shall oppose it, and those who support it today will have a lot of explaining to do to their constituents as the impacts of this unfold over the years ahead.
Simon Hall.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all say how hugely grateful I am to the people of North Dorset for returning me to this place to allow me to continue to speak and work on their behalf. I think it's worthwhile just reminding ourselves that this was a national referendum, and I hear what colleagues from Northern Ireland and Scotland say, but we didn't say that all 4 constituent parts of the United Kingdom had to vote uniformly. It was a national referendum on a first-past-the-post basis, and it is a very thin veneer of defence for an argument supporting separatism to hide behind when they trot out these lines. For those who have questioned this side of the House's commitment to protecting and enhancing the rights of workers, Mr Deputy Speaker, I hope it won't embarrass or upset the opposition too much when I point out that my party is now the party of the workers of this country. They have voted for us in huge, huge number. And I would have to ask, no thank you, and I would have to ask, I hope a rhetorical question, why would any party in government seek to undermine the rights of those people who have turned in such great number to support us, not least in order to get Brexit done? Now, this is, of course, Mr. Deputy Speaker, a sad day. Other colleagues have commented upon the paralysis which we've endured over the last 18 months or so. Today should have been taking place to allow exit from the European Union in March. So I do hope that a spirit of broader pragmatism and cooperation can break out. And a number of people have reflected upon some of the key messages of the electoral event of last Thursday. My take is that it was a civil war, but without the blood. Voters in great number picked up a ballot paper and a stubby pencil and reasserted their rights, reaffirmed their role as our masters and bosses. And we cannot, as Democrats, ask the people of this country to give us a decision, and then when we find it either surprising or inconvenient, find every trick in the book to try to evade and dodge it. Because I noticed in my postbag, and I'm sure other colleagues found this as well, up until May of this year, I seemed to be inundated by constituents who had ideas about how to break the deadlock, break the impasse, move things forward. But after May, and certainly after the elections to the European Parliament, people were starting to write to either say they were so fed up they were minded effectively just to opt out of the democratic lives in this country, or worse, were trying to explore avenues of civil disobedience in order to some way ventilate their growing frustration at the arrogance of too many people in this place who thought that they knew better than the people. And what greater exposition of that arrogance was there just last week from the campaign from the Liberal Democrats? Illiberal and undemocratic, worthy of neither titles that they give to their names. The smug intellectual arrogance that they deployed, that they knew somehow. Where are they? Where are they, says my honourable friends from Dorset South and elsewhere. Where are they? But that terrible righteous smugness, which seems to be a unique part of liberal democracy DNA, that they know more and better than everybody else. I won't give way. And of course I'll give way to my honourable friend.
On the point of smug, can I invite him just to reflect on the result in Scotland and remind the House how many of his colleagues were here from Scotland before the election and how many were returned after it?
Well, let us be frank, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The SNP had a very successful result, not as good as he and I will remember of 2015, and it will, as others have commented, present challenges for those of us who believe fundamentally in the preservation of the Union, who will now need to find arguments which are more compelling than merely the broad, abstract, romantic, and not so much focused just on the pounds, shillings and pence, but making the positive case for the Union. And I think that is an important point, because as we face into both the opportunities and the challenges of our country leaving the European Union, I am absolutely convinced that we stand the best and strongest chance of making a success of this new chapter of our national story if we stand shoulder to shoulder and do it together. May I just say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, a brief word in relation to Northern Ireland. It's very clear that as the only part of the kingdom which has a land border with a country which will remain part of the European Union, that we needed a border. The question was what and where. We tried the north-south. and we found it to be impossible and not supported by many. The East-West proposal is clearly not perfect and of itself presents challenges. But I don't believe, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the people of this country define themselves by the narrow rules which govern their custom arrangements. It is far more deep and spiritual than that. It is key that we maintain the integrity of the unity of our United Kingdom. The challenge, which I'm fully alert that the front bench is seized of, is to ensure that whatever regime of customs arrangements flow, they are of the lightest of touch and are, in essence, cost neutral. And we can do that through all sorts of VAT reclaim and other mechanisms. Let me conclude, Mr. Deputy Speaker, by saying that the people have spoken. And we on this side of the House are their champions. We listened to what they said in 2016. We've heard it again. The challenge for this place, we on this side of the House, are fully armed to ensure that we restore the democratic legitimacy of this place, the national respect for it. The challenge will be for opposition parties now to put aside the arguments which they have deployed in full sincerity and in good heart, but simply they have lost. It is time to move on. This bill gives us the opportunity to do so. It has my full support.
Order. Could I remind the House again that there are still some 20 members waiting to be called, and we are trying to impose self-denying ordinance of 6 minutes. I'd be grateful if honourable members would stick to that. That said, we do allow a degree of leeway to maiden speeches, and it's a pleasure to welcome the new member for Stirling, Mr. Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I rise to make my first speech in this place with, I'll confess, a mix of emotions. Until Friday last, I was a member of the European Parliament, proudly representing Stirling along with the rest of Scotland within our European family of nations. I now find myself here contemplating our removal from it. I'm proud to represent Stirling, my new home, with 51% of the vote. The heart of Scotland voted SNP along with much of the rest of our nation. Stirling's the ancient capital, a historic city, the scene of many old battles, and a big heart with a great future. The seat at 2,187 square kilometres, forgive me the members opposite, I don't know it in miles, is comparable in size to Luxembourg and every bit as diverse. We've got many vibrant villages, communities, Drimmen, Gargunnock and Strathblane in the west, Cowie, Fallin and Pleen in the east, Killin, Crianlarich and Tyndrum in the north, St Ninians and the Windsor Milton in the south, Callander, Bridge of Allen and Dunblane. We truly are Scotland in miniature. Rich farmland, breathtaking scenery, a world-class university and college. Held by the SNP at local government in the National Parliament of Scotland. We won the European election handsomely and we now represent it in this place as well. I'm privileged particularly to represent a number of former mining communities, places where loyalty and community still matter. The Paul Mays pit was the first out and the last back in the 1984 miners' strike. I am deeply honoured to have the trust of such proud communities, people who believe in deeds, not words. I ask only to be judged by mine. It's customary in a first speech in this place to pay tribute to one's predecessor. I do so gladly. Stephen Kerr and I may not agree on everything, but we do agree on the importance of democracy and public service. I pay tribute to his service. I wish him, his family and his team all the best for the future, for whatever it brings. And indeed, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I wish the same for all of us, because this is a momentous day for some in this House. It is a day of deep sadness for many of us. I assure you, Mr. Speaker, today's vote will live in infamy. It is not the end of Brexit, it's the start of something far worse. And it is an arithmetic fact, not a matter of opinion, an arithmetic fact, that Scotland has not consented to this. We're not leaving the European Union. We're being dragged out against our will by a government we rejected. And hence my mixed emotions. I stood for this place to try to stop Brexit. I won Stirling with 51% of the vote. The SNP won 80% of the seats in Scotland. The pro-EU Lib Dems won 4 more. And yet, despite that, Brexit is happening, I now accept. But I would counsel the benches opposite to beware hubris. For in what you call your victory today lie the seeds of a far greater defeat. I understand from some of the interventions previously there are some scholars in the House. Well, may I suggest some festive reading for you all, the history of Czechoslovakia. Start around January 1991 and see what happens. A union can only, and the United Kingdom is a union of nations. Do us the courtesy of using the right words. A union can only be maintained and endure if there is consent and respect. It is an arithmetic fact that Scotland, in all our recent votes, has not consented to where we are now, and the actions of this House prove a lack of respect of Scotland's democracy. I have concluded years since, along with my party, that Scotland's best future lies as an independent state in the European Union. Many people in Stirling agree with me, many do not, and that is an ongoing, lively conversation. But there are many more than that agree that it should be for Scotland to choose our future. And what is being done to us today is a grave, deep injustice that will not stand and will have consequences. We in these benches have long said that this place doesn't work for Scotland. In passing this grubby, shabby bill today, you will prove us right. Today will not be the end of this matter, however wishful thinking may be employed on the opposite benches. Scotland is a European nation, and Scotland will be heard.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, for calling me to speak in this historic debate. I have the privilege to follow the new Honourable Member for Stirling, who I must say spoke very well. I have to confess I didn't agree with every word he said, but I must say he delivered it admirably, and I think that augurs well for his future in this House. Mr Deputy Speaker, in 1997, I fought Ken Livingstone in Brent East. Just enough of the 16,000 teensy-weensy little votes, and I would have beaten him. But in a hustings in Willesden Green Library 22 years ago, he taught me a lesson I have never forgotten. He said that as a Member of Parliament, and of course he was and I was not, a general election is an opportunity to commune with your 68,000 employers. Well, I have 79,000 employers in Rayleigh and Whitford, sir, but the principle is exactly the same, and I place on record today my gratitude to them for re-employing me to represent them, for renewing my contract of employment to speak on their behalf. In this House, we got into a terrible mess because too many people here forgot they worked for their employers and not the other way around.
My honourable friend give way.
Yes, briefly.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and I add to my congratulations on his re-election, and deservedly so, because he has been a stalwart on behalf of his constituents and on the cause of British independence from the European Union for many long years in this House. And does he not agree that the British people have given us a clear message that it is time to confirm their vote of 3.5 years ago, and it shouldn't have taken that long?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. Mr Deputy Speaker, we spent some 40 years, and I've given way once, some 40 years in this House arguing over Europe, and in the end the only thing we could agree on was that we couldn't agree. And so we voted overwhelmingly to give the decision to the people in a referendum, and then some in this House spent 3 years deliberately ignoring the result. They pulled every trick in the book the Grieve Amendment, the Letwin Amendment, time after time, in order to try and overturn a result with which they and the British establishment patently did not agree. We played a ridiculous game where some on those benches, some and indeed some on these, stuck to a mantra of "I will never vote to allow us to crash out with no deal." What they meant was, "I'll never ever vote for us to leave the EU under any circumstances, but because of the referendum I can't say so." So finally we had to have this general election to break the logjam. And I'm afraid those on these benches that took that view, who assured us time and again they were doing what their constituents wanted, were proven incorrect, because their constituents had the opportunity to renew their contract of employment and patently in every single case declined to do so. Also, Mr Steve Bray, the man in the hat, stood as a Liberal Democrat candidate in a Welsh constituency, had the courage to put his name on the ballot paper and came sixth and lost his deposit. And we wish him a happy and silent retirement. Mr Deputy Speaker, the war in this place over Europe, and it has been a war, is finally coming to a close, not because there was a truce, but because the British people imposed their will on us and told us unequivocally in the general election they wanted to leave. Many here had argued for 2 years for a people's vote. We've just had one. It's called a general election, and the outcome was unmistakably clear. The people of this country peacefully and democratically voted to get Brexit done. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, we will leave the European Union at 11 p.m. GMT on the 31st of January, and I hope, Mr Speaker, in line with EDM2, the House authorities may allow Big Ben to chime at that time to mark that historic occasion. Because, by God, after all this, we're not doing it again. But when we vote on this bill, when the bells ring this afternoon, Mr Speaker, we will be doing so to obey the instructions of the British people. They have given us an unmistakable order to leave the European Union, and we will vote for this bill in order to comply with what our employers have told us they want us to do. It could not be clearer, and as my honourable friend from North Shropshire, with whom I have fought this battle for many years, so clearly said, it's called democracy. Mr Deputy Speaker, the people have spoken, and we will listen. We will do what they want, and when the sun rises on the 1st of February, it will do so on a free country. Mr Deputy Speaker, all I want for Christmas is not you.
Emma Littlebuck.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. In the 2016 referendum, I promised my constituents, whatever the result is, whatever mandate you give, I will respect it. In 2017, I stood on a manifesto that said I would continue to respect that mandate, would work for a deal and to avoid no deal. That is exactly what I did. In this election, I was clear with my constituents I still respected that mandate and I would work for a deal to leave the EU. People respond to clear and consistent messaging. My party's catch-all Brexit policy failed. Today was and still is an opportunity to stop this procrastination, to send a message to our lost voters, the voters our party was created to give a voice to in Parliament, that we do hear them, we do value them, and we do genuinely want to rebuild their trust. I am fed up of hearing we need to listen more to our working class communities, communities that some people in here speak of as a kind of homogenous bloc, whom they all assume, think and feel exactly the same way. They certainly do not. Many of us in here listen to our communities every single day. Some of us who did that are no longer in this place because others refuse to hear or act on the voices of their constituents that they so passionately articulated. I am deeply saddened that my right honourable friend, the former member for Don Valley, who has been an utterly fierce champion for democracy, for her constituents and for those of us who wanted to honour the promises we made to our voters, is no longer with us on these benches. She, along with my honourable friends, the former members for Great Grimsby, Crewe and Nantwich, Stoke-on-Trent North, Stoke-on-Trent Central and Lee, were, and I know they take absolutely no pleasure in this at all, right on this every single step of the way. This debate and this place is poorer without them. Just over 8 weeks ago, they and I voted for second reading of this bill. And although it has now changed, in my time in this House, we've often voted for second reading of bills. We don't like them sometimes, but it's not given a blank cheque. It's an opportunity to move the debate forward, propose amendments and seek improvements to the bill. I will vote for it again today. As for the programme motion, it is short. Last time we tried to force the government to offer more time, we ended up in the worst general election in my memory. And now, as much as I am utterly heartbroken by it, the party opposite has an overwhelming mandate they did not have the last time we held this debate. I will vote for the programme motion as well and put my energy into making the case for changes in committee stages. I don't want to just oppose for opposition's sake. We need to build consensus and stop the combative nature of this debate. It serves no one, and the last 3 years have proven that. Mr Deputy Speaker, this has been an awful toxic period in our politics. I have despaired at how this place has descended so many times into the most divisive, base, angry, gallery-pleasing politics. It might make for good headlines, but it does not make for a serious, functioning Parliament that people can have any respect or any faith in. I will always deliver on the promises that I make to my constituents. Their faith in me always matters. My word to them matters. It is with the heaviest of hearts that I can't vote with my party today. But I will always put my constituents before everything else, because the day I don't is the day I no longer deserve the honour of being their voice in this place.
Mr Deputy Speaker, and welcome to the Chair. It's going to be a delight over many years to serve under your enlightened chairmanship, I have no doubt. As I listened to this debate, I contrasted the contributions of my my right honourable friend from Ashford with the honourable gentleman from Leeds. They both campaigned for Remain. One has accepted the result and one remains in denial about the result of that referendum in 2016. It is that contrast between the acceptance of the democratic will of the people and the perpetual denial of those who campaign for Remain but can't come to terms with the result, which has characterised the debate in this House before the election. And this election finally settles that matter, because the Prime Minister, at some risk to himself and indeed to many of us, put his reputation on the line by saying to the British people, do you trust me to deliver this or don't you? And the British people have delivered their verdict. And they do want us to deliver this, not necessarily, by the way, because they wanted to leave in the first place, but simply because they want the matter settled. They want to deliver the certainty that is critical for British business and critical for the integrity of our democracy. To continue to frustrate the will of the people would have done untold harm to the very spirit which should imbue this place and which gives life and health to democratic legitimacy. So that is why I will be voting for this bill this evening, beyond all else. But it's not the only reason why. I also have opposed the European Union consistently throughout my political career, indeed stretching back into my boyhood, which was something like 40 years ago, and I know that seems surprising. I know that seems unlikely, but it was 40 years ago that I was a boy, when I first when I first advocated withdrawal from the European Union as a student at Nottingham University back in the late 1970s. I did so, of course, because the European Union is regulatory. And as a minister, I remember countless occasions when civil servants would come to me, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and say, "It's bad news from Europe, Minister. We're looking at ways we can get around it, dilute it, avoid it." And I would say, well, do all you can, as I did in respect to the Ports Directive referred to by my Russian friend a few moments ago. I can never remember them saying, "Great news from Europe, Minister. This is going to be really beneficial for the British people." The regulatory burden that's emanated from the European Union has been immensely unhelpful to Britain and the British economy, time after time. I oppose the European Union also because it's costly. You know, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the latest House of Commons figures suggest, House of Commons library figures suggest 8.9 billion is the net cost of our membership of this very expensive club. Indeed, in every year since we joined in 1973, we have been net contributors, except, interestingly enough, for 1975, the year of the referendum. What happened then? The referendum happened then when, on that one single year, we were a net beneficiary to the tune of 395 million. In every other year, we have been paying dear to bear this regulatory burden. But although I oppose the European Union in all its success for those reasons, that is not the fundamental reason. It is this, that when power is exercised detached from the people it affects, it first becomes careless and ultimately becomes capricious. When people lose the ability to hold to account those who make decisions for them, then democracy is undermined. And that, in the end, is the reason I campaigned with such vigour to leave the European Union in the referendum, and have consistently argued so from my boyhood into my middle age, which I am now about to enjoy. Now, the denial I described earlier, Mr. Speaker, I think is a test of character for those who sit opposite. You know, the test of character in victory is humility. The test of character in defeat is wisdom. And the position adopted by those who will vote against this bill tonight, many of whom I respect, by the way, as individual members of this House, the test for them tonight is whether they will exercise wisdom. For to vote against this bill is not merely implausible, it's fundamentally unwise. Which brings me, you'll be glad to know, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to my concluding remarks.
No.
Well, no. I know that will disappoint more members than it pleases, but nonetheless I must make room for others to contribute. G.K. Chesterton wrote, "How you think when you lose determines how long it will be before you win." And I simply say to those sitting opposite, how they behave now will determine how they are thought of now, but into the future. And perhaps I can finish on this note, for I spoke about my consistent position. There are critics of me here and more broadly, not many, I acknowledge, but there are critics. But one thing I cannot be criticised for is inconsistency. And it was C.S. Lewis who said that consistency is the mark of greatness. I just hope that if I'm consistent, then one day I might be great too. Thank you so much.
Order. Just before I call Alison McGovern, to say that the informal recommendation now for speeches, colleagues, so we can get everyone in before wind-up start at 2 o'clock, is 5 minutes per speech. Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Streeting, and I would like to say what a joy it is to follow the member for South Holland and the Deepings. I mean, my quotes are normally a bit more Jarvis Cocker and Bill Shankly than G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis, but he makes a good contribution. And it's his point about undermining democracy that I really want to begin with. Firstly, obviously, Mr. Streeting, I must thank my constituents in Wirral South, because not only did they take the decision to re-elect me for the 4th time, but even those who I know for a fact were definitely not voting for me, were incredibly kind. And that is the quality of the people in the Wirral. So I thank them all. When it comes to undermining democracy, I think we need to step back from some of the language in this debate, because it is perfectly legitimate to be triumphalist in victory. And I take nothing for granted, but if my team win the league this season, I will certainly be triumphalist. However, this is not football. This is incredibly important, and whilst the Prime Minister has a mandate for his manifesto, we are still a democracy. And in a democracy, you take pride in listening to dissenting voices. And it is that voice of dissent that we are at risk of crushing in this debate. Because this bill has huge problems. Worse, the ameliorations that many in this House, including colleagues on this side who voted for the bill, they worked hard to place ameliorations against the worst aspects of Brexit into the bill that we heard before the election. And some of those ameliorations have now been removed. Firstly, no deal is firmly back on the table. Clause 33 does it. It reintroduces that huge jeopardy that we might leave the European Union without a deal, and the consequences of doing so are grim. The risk to peace, in terms of having no agreement with the European Union, and where that would leave the relationship for those on the island of Ireland. The fact of the limit to medicines, where no deal could mean significant problems for medical supplies on cross-channel routes, and the immediate impact on the health and lives of people in Britain. And finally, we know what no deal would do to food supplies. So reintroducing that risk using this bill is a massive mistake. And I'm not going to rehearse all of the reasons why this idea that it's necessary for a negotiating position are wrong, because we know it's wrong. The Prime Minister wants to do it, and I'm afraid if he thinks the days of hearing objections to that negotiating stance are over because we have a new Parliament, Mr Streeting, he is very much mistaken. Secondly, from discussing a hard border on the island of Ireland, we will now be discussing a hard border in Merseyside. Because the impact of having that border in the Irish Sea for my constituents in the Wirral, for people who live in Liverpool and in Sefton, where the Port of Liverpool is, and the cross-channel ferries between Birkenhead and Belfast are significant. And if people in this House think that because Merseyside votes somewhat counter to the national trend, they will be forgotten, I am telling them they are wrong. Because the people of Merseyside want to know that Brexit is not going to do such an irreparable damage to our relationships, both commercial and of friendship, between ourselves and the people on the other side of the Irish Sea. So we will be making our objections to this clear. I want to know what assessment has been done, specifically an economic assessment of the impact of this policy. And we heard great maiden speeches for the members for Belfast South and North Down earlier, who made these points clear. Brexit to us is not just a risk to our economy, it's a risk to our identity. And we won't allow that point to go unheard. Finally, on parliamentary sovereignty, briefly. The former member for Stoke North, Gareth Snell's efforts to get us in this House a say, to get a parliamentary lock on the future relationship, unfortunately have now failed. The Prime Minister has ripped up commitments that he made to people who were prepared to vote for his deal. I think that is an unworthy thing to do, and I think he should have kept those parliamentary locks in this bill. So, in conclusion, Mr Streeting, on any economic measures, the consequences of this bill are grim. And the democratic consequences of this bill are worse. The big question now, given the result of the general election, and I would just say to the Conservative Party, yes, they won a general election, but some seats they won by a number of hundred votes. So I wouldn't use those few hundred votes in crucial places as a mandate to forget all the people who didn't vote for them in those areas. So the Prime Minister has got control of this House now, and he can drum his Brexit through. But that's not the real question. The question is, when there are nations in our union and cities in our country that do not consent to the Prime Minister, and when he has shown so little care for those places, how will he respond? Because if his future is one where it's his way or nothing, then my party will need to plan an alternative future. And that is the work that we on this side will now get on with.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And before I start, can I thank the voters of South Dorset for returning me? I'm humbled to be returned again and look forward to serving them to the best of my ability. The Prime Minister is not here, nor is the Speaker, but I also welcome them both to their places. The Prime Minister, because I backed him and I believe he is the man for the job. The Speaker, because I believe he will bring integrity back into this place that sadly was beginning to be lost. Can I also welcome new members? It is an absolute pleasure to see them all here, particularly, dare I say, on our side of the House. Years ago, it seems like years ago now, before I was elected in 2010, I adopted a battle cry. It was, "We want our country back." In fact, it was so good that Nigel Farage nicked it when he was in charge of UKIP, and he freely admits that. That wasn't some sort of xenophobic, Union Jack, waving, isolationist standpoint. It's because, like many of my constituents who voted to leave, we wanted control of our country. We wanted our beloved country to have control of her destiny. It really is as simple as that. The Leader of the Opposition, in his speech, talked about ripping our communities apart, job losses, and a whole raft of negative comments he made. A once respected Labour Party has sadly been hijacked by the far left. I have huge respect for many members of the party opposite, but it's been hijacked. And had the Leader of the Opposition won, as he tried to do, this country of ours would have been torn apart. Exactly. I have absolutely no doubt of that at all. Trust the people. Trust the people, trust the people. I failed once in this House when I voted for the deal on the third occasion, and I apologise 2 days later. Since then, just before the election last week, I began to wonder whether the people would return us and allow us to do what they wanted us to do. They did. And when the exit poll was announced, I simply couldn't believe that we would have a majority of about 80 MPs. And we have. And here we are. So now, honour, democracy can be returned to this place. We can serve the people who send us here. I accept there are still many views from all different sides of this House. But as my honourable friend said in his excellent speech, it's time now to move on. It really is. Just imagine what this country of ours could achieve if together, all sides, buried their differences, respected the people of this country, the United Kingdom, and stepped out into this brave new world where opportunities are there, and I can see them. And in 5 years' time, we've had a few naysayers today. I would ask them in 5 years' time, were you wrong to say what you said today in the House of Commons? And I'm pretty certain they'll have to say, Richard, I was wrong. Because we have a great future. It's important, and I aim these comments at the front bench, to get this Brexit done, yes, but then to return to the domestic agenda, which sadly has been ignored for all the reasons we know for more than 3.5 years. Certainly in South Dorset we need better road and rail connectivity, and we need proper social affordable housing. This is the chance for our party, with all our new MPs from the north, to reach out right across the country and to deliver, and we must. I issue a warning to the other place when this bill goes up there. Don't start playing games now. We've had enough. The people of this country had enough, and the other place must pass this bill and allow us to get on with leaving the EU on the 31st of January. Finally, on the fishing and agriculture, can I also say to the front bench, whatever you do, do not sell these parts of our economy short. Let's stick together. Let's do what we said we're going to do. Leave the EU. And by December 2020, if indeed no free trade agreement is made, we must go. But I am confident that that will be achieved by December 2020. And lastly, like other colleagues, I'd like to wish every member of this House and the staff, and particularly my staff, a very happy Christmas.
Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Sir Gary. I would like to thank voters in Dulwich and West Norwood for re-electing me to serve as their Member of Parliament. It is an honour to represent one of the most diverse constituencies in the country, a constituency which in 2016 voted overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union. And in my experience, the strength of my constituents' pro-EU views has only grown over the past 3 years. The vast majority of my constituents did not vote to get Brexit done, and my mandate from them is to keep standing up for our values in Dulwich and West Norwood and to champion their interests. Our values are those of outward-facing internationalism, celebration of diversity and community solidarity. These are the values that underpin our support for membership of the EU, and these are the values that lead us also to be deeply concerned about Brexit and this government's reckless approach to it. Our values lead us to be concerned about the protections people are afforded in their workplace, the protection of our environment and our response to the climate emergency. They lead us to prioritise human rights and to be concerned about how governments are held to account for human rights abuses which happen on their watch. And they lead us to be concerned about refugees and to want the UK to play a full role in responding to the global refugee crisis by welcoming people who have lost everything and helping them to rebuild their lives. Indeed, many of my constituents are already playing their part through community sponsorship groups, and they want to see the government doing the same. So we are dismayed in this withdrawal agreement bill to see the government jettison its previous commitment to the Dubs Amendment on child refugees and the non-regression clauses, which were designed to ensure that the UK does not move backwards on workers' rights relative to the EU, or at least that if the government did so, it would be completely transparent and they could be held to account. In relation to human rights, the last government removed the UK's commitment to the Charter of Fundamental Rights. This bill further waters down the commitment to the European Convention on Human Rights, and the political declaration makes no mention of rights previously protected by the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. There is a real risk that hard-won rights fought for over hundreds of years could be watered down by this or any other future government. The Prime Minister's reckless approach to the implementation period is nothing short of a disgrace. There is not a shred of evidence that a trade deal with the EU can be secured within a year. The EU says it can't. All trade deal precedents indicate that it can't. Yet the Prime Minister seeks to enshrine in law the crashing out of the UK from the EU with no trade deal in just a year's time. Brexit will not be done. It will be doing its worst to communities up and down the country where jobs will be lost and lives left devastated if we crash out in a year's time. I urge newly elected members opposite to reflect very carefully on what exactly this will mean for the communities they represent, and to heed the warnings of UK manufacturers about the dependence of supply chains on our membership of the single market and customs union. None of this is hypothetical. It is about the ability of thousands of people to go to work in secure, well-paid jobs which keep a roof over their family's head. It is about the rights of working people to holiday pay, maternity and parental leave, sick pay and protection from discrimination and unfair dismissal. I'll give way.
The member for giving way. Will she accept that actually in many cases UK standards are higher than that of the European Union? And I'm very confused as to why members opposite keep using the EU as a gold standard when actually it's the UK that's the gold standard.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention, but I don't accept that that's the case, and I don't accept that this bill does anything other than leave those rights to the mercy of any future government. And I don't trust this Prime Minister to maintain the standards that we have derived from the EU. It is about, we'll not give way further, it is about the protection of our woodlands, rivers and coastal habitats at a time when the environment could not be more important. And it is about the practical expression of our values in the way we treat the world's most vulnerable children. I understand, Sir Gary, that the Prime Minister has a majority, which means that he will pass this bill and we will leave the European Union. But my constituents will not be denied a voice in that debate. Make no mistake, this bill will deliver nothing but damage to the UK on many fronts. I will oppose it, I will stand up for my constituents' values and for their interests, and I will hold this government to account for the consequences of their reckless actions.
Thank you. Colleagues, we're not doing terribly well on timing. We have 15 more colleagues to speak, and 2 o'clock is when their wind-ups will begin. My maths are poor, but I believe that's 4 minutes each. Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's an honour to be back in this House almost 2.5 years to the day when I was first elected, and I'd like to thank the good people of Chelmsford for re-electing me to this place. This has been 2.5 years of endless squabbling and going round in circles. And this afternoon, we will be able to put that squabbling to an end, get Brexit done, and also move on. And for some of us, this has been a very long journey. I first campaigned for a referendum over a decade ago. 10 years ago, I stood and was elected to the European Parliament on a platform calling for reform that Europe needed to modernise. 5 years ago, I stood with the gentleman who is now the honourable member for Ipswich on a platform for the European Parliament, saying that it needed to reform and we needed to renegotiate and we would have a referendum. We then had that referendum. And I have to admit, as a Brit in Brussels, chairing a major committee in that Parliament after the referendum, it was not easy. I was a major target for anyone who wanted to throw political abuse at Britain. There were days when I literally felt that the arrows to my front had met the knives in my back. But I also felt that there were friends across Europe who wanted to help us move on, and to avoid an acrimonious divorce, and to move on into a new, deep and special partnership. That partnership has been outlined by the Prime Minister again today, and a partnership that also respects democracy. And it was democracy that came up again and again on the doorsteps in this general election. Our country has a proud reputation of standing up for democracy across the world. How do we stand firm with the people of Hong Kong, with Zimbabwe, with the Rohingya from Burma, with people in Venezuela, if we do not respect democracy in our own country? And the Prime Minister, in his first speech after the election, called for healing. It's time to stop putting people into those pigeonholes of leave and remain. It is time to move on. And today, when I vote for the agreement today, it is the first step on moving on. And yes, we need to get a trade deal. We need to get a trade deal with the EU, and they need to get one with us. They're our largest trading partner, we're theirs. And we can get a trade deal within the year, and we must get a trade deal within the year. And it can be done because so much of the detail has already been agreed, not only by us, but all 27 other countries as well. They've agreed tariff-free, quota-free trade. They've agreed a deal that works for our fishing and our farming, and a deal that can work for financial services. Remember, 10p in every pound that we spend as taxpayers comes from financial services. We've agreed a deal that works for the environment, and crucially, as a supporter of science, a deal that works for ongoing cooperation in science, security and student exchanges. A lot of this election was about one nation conservatism, and I am winding up. And one nation conservatism is not only about, crucially, holding our United Kingdom together. It is also about a conservatism that works for all sectors of our economy, a conservatism that is committed to well-funded public services funded by a strong economy, a conservatism that believes that we must protect our environment and put it in a better place for future generations, a conservatism that is committed to our role in the world and believes that every single person in this country has an equal right to a fair chance in life. And that is the conservatism that we will be supporting when we vote for this crucial step this afternoon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Sadly, we live in a very divided country, and I've listened in vain to the opposition benches, the government benches, sorry, to hear if they have any understanding of the 16 million people who voted to remain in the European Union. In my city last week, 44,000 to 9,000 who voted to remain. And I have got no sense the government understands those people. And that is a very dangerous situation, because people are proud to be citizens of the European Union, and we do not welcome the erosion of the rights that we currently enjoy. So when there is celebration in a few weeks' time by some, there will be real grief from others, and there will be anger as well. And they will actually have a good reason to be angry with some, because in the last Parliament there was a real prospect of securing a confirmatory referendum. And the Prime Minister knew that. That's why he was so desperate to get to his election. He was on the ropes. He was on the ropes. But to everyone's astonishment, and of course they're not here, the Liberal Democrats came to the rescue. And they took a huge gamble with the future of this country. And of course it failed, and they have paid a heavy price. But sadly, so has the whole country. But what I will say is their role in this will not be forgotten. But I'm an optimist, and I did not vote for the election. I voted against it, which I have to say got the biggest cheer in the hustings in Cambridge. No elections in December ever again, please. But I'm an optimist, and I would say to Remainers that there is hope, because what I think we've seen so far from this Prime Minister is, despite the bluster, he folds under pressure. He folded when the Irish issue looked to be derailing his progress. And, of course, he, as the member for, Right Honourable Member for Leeds Central so well explained, buckled and did what the Prime Minister and the previous Prime Minister said they would never do, create a border down the Irish Sea. But less commented on is how he buckled under pressure from Farage when he was threatening to put up candidates in every seat, because that is when no deal was brought back by that promise to not allow an extra period of extension to the transition period. Now, of course, we know this is all a stunt, a negotiating ploy, but what it shows is that pressure works. So I'd say keep pressure on the Prime Minister. Now, a so-called skinny trade deal may keep goods flowing, and that's important, but so are the flows of people and research collaborations. And I think, however hard we try, the truth is that we will no longer be a voice in the room in those important negotiations. And what we will actually have, no, I'm not going to give away, what we will actually find is that we will have a whole army of people over there, actually in Brussels, trying to persuade others to make the argument on our behalf. A delicious irony, which I think we will come to see. Because basically, we will be living in a world where we will be having to follow rules over which we have no influence making. That is the reality of the future. And people will come to say, at some point, wouldn't it be better if we did have some influence? Wouldn't it be better if we had a say? So, Mr Deputy Speaker, that debate will come, but in the meantime, I think we will have to live with what is in fact a Brexit fiction. Because there is in reality no Brexit. You always have to have a relationship with your neighbours. The question is how you manage that, how you negotiate it. Do you just have endless negotiations and arguments, or do you live within a civilised set of institutions and rules that make it so much better?
Thank you very much. Kept to time beautifully. Robert Courts.
Very much, Mr Streeter. And may I also extend my congratulations to Mr Speaker on my first time speaking after the election, albeit, of course, he's not in the chair at the moment. May I also congratulate the Honourable Member for Cambridge on the speech that he's just made. He, as always, argues his case with eloquence and courtesy, even if I don't agree with quite everything that he said. Mr Streeter, this has been a challenging election for all of us. The Honourable Member, of course, referred to it being a December election, and I'd also like to give my thanks, above all, to the people of West Oxfordshire for having returned me again. I'm very humbled and grateful for the trust they've put in me. They not only had to endure a December election, but this is the third general election in 3 years for them and for me. But at every electoral contest that there has been since 2015, we have promised that we would do as we were instructed on the question of Britain's place in the European Union. And that's what we have a chance to do today. We have a chance to show that we will do as we were told, and that we will do what we said we would do. But it's also an important time for us to put to bed the question of this country's place in Europe. This is a question that has bedevilled and tormented this country for longer than I have been alive. And I am quite clear, as I've been speaking to people around my own constituency and around the country, that whilst this country warmly welcomes a relationship of trade and of cooperation and of culture, they never wanted to be part of a political union. And inexorably, that is the direction in which the European Union has been, and certainly since the advent of the euro, for many years, leading. We have a chance tonight to bring the country together, and we do so by putting to bed this question. And the free trade agreement destination that tonight's bill leads to is one that will unify the British people, because it gives them the chance to step outside of the political union, to step outside of ever closer union, but to maintain strong links of culture and of friendship and of cooperation and of trade that we all warmly welcome. In answer to the honourable member who spoke earlier, when he says, how do you represent and recognise the concerns of those who voted to remain, that's how I propose we do that, by ensuring that we have close links of trade, friendship, culture and cooperation. But there's something else we can do as well. There's something else that we can show that we are not just a talking shop in this House. We don't just argue amongst ourselves, bickering, arguing, failing to make a decision, but we can actually move the country forward. Because if there's one other thing that I've heard that people desperately want, it is for us to move on. It is for us to stop the endless bickering and arguing and changing our mind and failing to show leadership and decision, which ultimately is what we're here for. We are sent here to make and take decisions, and we have the chance to do that today. And it is so dismaying when I listened to the Leader of the Opposition earlier to realise that there's this cold vacuum at the heart of Labour where there should be a policy. To hear that the Leader of the Opposition seems to have learned nothing from the preceding 6 weeks, that if you don't keep the promises you make to the electorate at an election, that they punish you, and to fall back on the same tired scapegoating that we're going to sell the NHS to Donald Trump when we're not, that we are in some way going to lead a charge to the bottom on safety standards, and to hear the maggot-infested orange juice scaremongering that he's been using for months and which has already been comprehensively debunked. Again, a fall to tired old scaremongering because they have nothing else to offer. What we have instead is a return, and this is something to welcome from whatever side of this argument you hailed, a return to full democratic self-government. That is something to welcome and to cherish whatever side of this argument you come. And I urge everybody, when they go through the division lobbies this afternoon, to welcome that and to look forward to the future with positivity and hope.
Thank you, Sir Gary. It is with deep sadness and loss that I stand here, knowing we will now be leaving the EU. It is with regret that we will not be able to hear the voices of the many people who have changed their minds and would now vote to remain in any final say referendum, or hear all those young people who would now get a chance to have a real say on their future. And for this, I am truly concerned. I'm concerned for the country, and I'm concerned for those people's futures. We're here, though, to scrutinise this legislation that does not even begin to meet the challenges that Brexit poses, that has taken out all elements that matter, and importantly, this Prime Minister is stripping Parliament of its voice and therefore denying the people and the country a say on its future. By scrapping powers for MPs to scrutinise future trade deals, we risk being forced to accept lower standards as a price for future trade agreements.
Those trade deals will now be conducted behind closed doors and without proper scrutiny. Trade deals which have an impact on our communities, on our businesses and our people, risking workers' rights, environmental regulation, food standards, by denying Parliament a voice. You are denying democracy and denying people a voice. You cannot call this a people's government if the first thing you do is ignore the people's representatives. As MPs, we're here to ensure our communities, people's livelihoods, businesses, jobs and futures are looked after and safeguarded, and this government is taking away that opportunity. And this deal fails to guarantee the future of our environmental standards. The binding part of the agreement contains nothing about environmental standards across the UK, and the non-binding political declaration just notes that parties should maintain those important environmental standards. And with only 11 months to negotiate a trade deal with the EU, the risk of no deal has significantly increased, the worst of all scenarios. But what of our EU citizens? Those citizens should never become the victims of Brexit. And I speak to many of them in Cardiff North, living in fear and anxiety over the future. Some who have lived here most of their lives, with children born here and lives rooted firmly here. EU citizens must be assured of their rights and should be immediately granted full rights that they enjoy today. And the EU will reciprocate with those UK citizens living in the EU. But by taking away also Lord Dubb's amendment to safeguard child refugees, the Prime Minister and his party, the party that apparently was founded to conserve, is now eroding the rights and values we hold so dear, selling out the things that make this country great. This has become not only an exit from the EU, but an exit from our responsibilities and common decency, and I will be voting against it today. But finally, let me end by saying, this bill, this law, will not strip me of my European identity. I will always be both European and Welsh in equal measure. My values and my identity have been formed from being a part of the European Union. Those values of openness, tolerance, inclusivity, of equality and a trust in the public good. Those values are now under threat from this Trumpian populist government, from right-wing populism and bigots everywhere. For me and for many of my constituents, leaving the EU will be a profound and deep loss. There is a reason why the many millions of us marched on the streets and have gone out of our way to fight for a future within the EU. Being European is an identity we want to keep. Allow us to keep it.
Thank you. Before I call Bob Seeley, I must now impose, I'm afraid, a formal limit of 4 minutes per speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That means if I take an intervention, I can have an extra minute, doesn't it? No. That's what it's like.
But you'll lose lots of friends on this side.
Oh no, we
can't lose lots of friends.
We can't have that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, thank you very much indeed. I'd like to thank my constituents on the Isle of Wight for re-electing me. This remains a huge privilege to work on their behalf, and I look forward to continuing to do so. It's a privilege to follow the honourable member for Cardiff North. I found her arguments about our democracy straight after a very clear general election to be somewhat tortuous, and as someone who's half English and who's half German, I love Europe. I'm not sure I want to be part of the European Union. In fact, I know I don't. They are different things. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Groundhog Day is ending. Thank God, democracy has reasserted itself. In the words of the guitar piece I'm trying to learn for Christmas, Jeff Buckley's cover, Hallelujah. The delay, frankly, has been a disgrace. MPs in a functioning democracy cannot choose which votes they respect, and they cannot call for new referendums because they didn't like the arguments or they didn't like the results of previous referendums. The party opposite has been defenestrated because they refused to carry out the pledge in 2017. And we hear two different versions of the future, one from the Honourable Member of Cardiff North, which is effectively denial, and one from the Honourable Member for South Shields, which is to accept the result and try to rebuild. One offers a route out for the Labour Party, one offers a route to an existential crisis and a chance never to hold power again. And it is up to them which way they take it. But throughout this summer, we had a Labour Party leadership led by several new leadership candidates now, who are tying themselves in knots like some sort of incompetent Houdini, and then forever being unable to get itself out of those tortuous knots in which it was tying itself. The Honourable Member for Dulwich and Norwood was absolutely right to say that her folks did not vote for Brexit, and she is right to champion Remain. However, in over 100 Labour seats, 52, that's in the previous Parliament, 52 had Leave majorities of over 60%, and 8 had Leave majorities of more than 70%. And many of those former honourable members are now looking for jobs because they did not listen to their people. And there is a lesson there for all of us. 17 million people voted to leave because they felt the political system no longer represented them. The European Union was not always part of the problem, but as the Honourable Member for the Deepings and South Holland shows, it wasn't part of the solution either. I am delighted that we are leaving the European Union because there has always been a relentless federalising agenda with which Britons have felt uncomfortable. But this is now our chance to chart a different course for a new great project. And this great project, as the Prime Minister says, is partly about leaving the European Union, but it is also partly about restoring folks' faith in democracy here and trust. And therefore, I look forward to voting for this important and great bill, and it's a good Christmas present for many of our constituents. We respect Remainers who voted to stay, but because we have a withdrawal deal, we can get the withdrawal deal through, and we can respect both sides while recognising that we are a Leave nation and we need to deliver for those people who voted in the 2016 referendum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I would like to thank the voters of Brentford and Isleworth, including Chiswick, Osterley and Hounslow, for returning me to this place last Thursday, and I commit to continue to serving them to the best of my ability. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister may have the majority in this House, but he doesn't in the country. Every opinion poll bar one this year showed a majority would vote to remain in a new referendum, and in the general election some 53% voted for parties promising to hold a new referendum. And as my friend for Greenwich said earlier, Brexit is a process, not an act that can be done quickly. Now, leaving our series of complex relationships built up over 40 years in just a year will, of course, be complex. So on behalf of our voters who voted Remain, like the majority of mine, and those who voted to leave, we have a duty to scrutinise this bill. It will have far-reaching consequences on our constituents, including those who had no vote last Thursday, the citizens of other EU countries who live here in the UK. And never has proper scrutiny of a bill been more important. Never have we had a Prime Minister that spends so much effort avoiding scrutiny. And we've noticed in recent weeks, when he can't avoid the question, he responds with a posh bloke version of Little Britain's Vicky Pollard. No, but you're. Now, with this House's most important legislation for many years, that withdraws our relationship with our allies and partners of 40 years, we have just 3 days of debate. And just a week after the election, and it seems promises on workers' rights have now been dropped. Now, I heard members opposite suggest it's OK, because we can have higher standards than EU members. But let me remind them, the EU sets minimum standards for workers' rights. There's only one reason to remove minimum standards, Mr Deputy Speaker, and that's because you want to fall below them. And on child refugees, the government is now threatening to scrap the right of refugee children to be reunited with their families here. How cruel is that? The government claim removal of the clause on refugee children is just for the purposes of negotiation. But as my friend the Lord Dubs said today, quote, vulnerable children are not bargaining chips. We should not be exploiting their misery for political purposes, but defending them as our own. Mr Deputy Speaker, on trade, the previous Prime Minister's Special Advisor, Raoul Ruparel, in the Institute of Government's recent paper, has warned that the UK is not match fit for the next phase of negotiations. I hope the government addresses this point. And finally, I want to address the issue raised in clause 26, which allows ministers to give binding instructions by regulation to any court in the country, and how to interpret and even how to disapply EU retained case law, as well as domestic case law which relates to EU retained law. My constituent, Ricardo Celestillo, a partner in an international law firm, contacted me last night with his concerns about clause 26. He said, quote, given the wide application of EU retained law, by allowing for EU retained case law and related domestic case law to be interpreted by the executive, Parliament would breach the fundamental principle that courts should be independent and that parties in civil and criminal matters need to have certainty of interpretation when involved in a dispute. Mr Deputy Speaker, for these and many other reasons outlined by my colleagues on this side of the House, I will vote against this bill.
Thank you, Mr Streeter. And I'd like to start by thanking the voters of Dudley South, not just the 68% who voted to return me for a third time to this House, but also the other 32% who took part in what was a well-spirited and fair campaign. But throughout the 6 weeks of the general election campaign, knocking on doors not only around Dudley South, but also Dudley North, in West Bromwich East, West Bromwich West, seats around the Black Country, there was a response that kept on coming back time and time again. It did not take slogans from political candidates or election broadcasts to raise the phrase, get Brexit done. It was coming from the doorstep. There was a determination, there was an impatience to get Brexit done. This bill that we are considering today will be one step closer to doing what should have been done a long time ago. Get Brexit done, do as we were told, do as we were instructed in the 2016 referendum. Because in all of those seats in which I was campaigning over the last 2 months, particularly in those areas with higher working class populations, the areas that for many, many years have been voting for Labour candidates, returning Labour members of Parliament to this House, the overwhelming sense was frustration, that people were tired of being ignored by their representatives, and Brexit was an obvious example. More than anything else, on the European Union, European policy, they were tired of being patronised by so many people who would claim to represent them. And we've even heard some of those sentiments today from the benches opposite. Suggestions that somehow, whether it was in the general election or in the referendum campaign, the voters who firstly voted for Brexit and now have voted overwhelmingly for a Conservative government with a strong Conservative majority, either didn't understand the question, they were misled either by lies or clever slogans. Perhaps their prejudices meant that they couldn't take a fair decision. Well, I think that these sentiments expressed by, unfortunately, a few of the members opposite, and particularly Labour members opposite, say rather more about the members making those expressions than it does about the voters up and down our country who have voted now 3 times for Britain to leave the European Union. They voted in that referendum. They voted for 2 parties in 2017, both of whom promised faithfully that they were committed to implementing that referendum result, and then when it turned out the main opposition party didn't actually mean what they said about keeping that promise, they voted last week to return a majority Conservative government with a good majority that will. The Leader of the Opposition has spent most of the last week trying to persuade anybody who will listen that the reason for his party's worst election performance in over 80 years was about Brexit rather than his own hopeless leadership. It is therefore extremely disappointing that he intends to march his members of Parliament through the division lobbies this afternoon to once again ignore those voters, many of whom are had been until last week, had been lifelong Labour supporters, Labour voters. In one case I spoke to, going back to the days they'd voted for Clement Attlee in 1951 but could no longer vote for this Labour Party because it's a Labour Party that doesn't speak for them, doesn't listen to them, so I will be supporting this bill today.
Grant.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to be able to speak in this debate. I'll be speaking and voting against the bill today, as I did 2 months ago. In the intervening period, of course, I've had the endorsement of 51.5% of my electorate in Glenrothes and Central Fife, for which I am enormously grateful. More importantly, my constituents voted by a majority of 4-1 for candidates who were opposed to this bill. My nation, my one nation, voted by 3-1 for candidates and parties who were against this bill. So to everyone who has told the Scottish National Party and other opposition parties from Scotland that there's some kind of duty on us to tag along with the Prime Minister just now, no. The only duty that any MP from Scotland can possibly discharge is to vote against this bill, to vote against this Brexit, and to vote against a government that is determined to show its complete contempt for the sovereign status of the citizens of Scotland, sovereign status which this Parliament unanimously agreed less than 2 years ago. I hear people saying that this is a great time, a great victory for the people. The Secretary of State wrote to us all yesterday saying what a great advance this was for the rights of our citizens. No, it's not. There's not a single citizen of these islands whose rights will be enhanced by the passage of this bill. True. Tens of millions of citizens will see their rights diminished. 3 million are now having to call into question yet again whether they will continue to have the right to live and work and love here as they always have done. The Prime Minister gave promises before the referendum on the 1st of June 2016. He broke those promises. I challenged him about it again on the 25th of July 2019, and you can check Hansard if you want to check it. And again, he made those promises that this exactly the same rights that EU citizens have just now, they'll continue to have after Brexit. And then he published this bill that tears up those promises yet again. And the government and the backbenchers are saying to us, on citizens' rights, on the rights of child refugees, on environmental protection, on food standards, it's not in the bill, but trust the Prime Minister. Well, last week, Mr Deputy Speaker, Scotland gave a very, very clear message to the Prime Minister. We do not believe you. We do not trust you. We will not allow you to take our nation out of this union of nations against the express will of our people, expressed in 2016, expressed in 2017, expressed twice in 2019. When is this party, this government that's reaching out across the House, when is it going to listen? And we heard a lot from earlier speakers about how important it is for the government to abide by its manifesto and what happens to parties when they don't abide by the manifesto. Could I suggest, as some of the Christmas reading, honourable and right honourable members opposite, look at the manifesto on which the National Government of Scotland was elected in 2016, and look in particular about the mandate that was sought and given as to what Scotland will do if and when we are taken out of the European Union against our will. Yeah. And I say to those reasonable members in the Conservative benches, and I know there are quite a few, please speak to your Prime Minister and warn the Prime Minister what will happen if he attempts to stand in the way of a democratically elected national government doing no more than deliver on the promises that it was trusted to deliver by the people of Scotland. Because otherwise, I have to say, particularly to members from English constituencies, because Brexit is essentially about England's inability to sort out its relationship with Europe. Scotland and Northern Ireland voted against. Wales voted for, but without a great deal of enthusiasm. That if the MPs representing English constituents take this step to go past the point of no return in the relationship with their neighbours across the North Sea, across the Channel and against the Irish Sea, they will also be taking England past the point of no return in the union with its neighbour across the Solway Firth.
Steve Devil.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I say it's an absolute pleasure to deliver the speech with you in the chair, albeit only briefly, but it's a great honour to serve while you're in the chair, and an honour to follow the honourable gentleman from the SNP. Can also start by placing on record my great thanks to the people of St Austell and Newquay for returning me to this House for the third time. I do not take any of those votes for granted, and will continue to serve them to the best of my ability. I will be supporting this bill tonight, and I just want to very briefly give 3 reasons why I believe it is the right thing to support this bill. Firstly, and most importantly for me, is because it delivers on the referendum result. It gets Brexit done. And we have spent far too long in this place, those of us who have been here over the last 3.5 years, going round and round in circles, frustrating the life out of the country whilst we make no progress at all. But at last, after 3.5 long years, we get to cross the line, we get to pass this bill so that we can all move on. We get to do what we said to the people we would do in 2016, to take back control of our laws, our borders and our money. And this bill passed the way for us to be able to do just that. And at last we have a Parliament that is willing to make that decision, that is actually representing what the people voted for in 2016. The other reason I believe it's right to support this bill is it does end the uncertainty. There's one thing that I heard loud and clear when the general election result came through just last week, was a huge sigh of relief from people right across my constituency, and I believe right across the country, that we can end the uncertainty at long last. We can end the debate about whether or not we're going to leave the EU and actually get on and move forward. It's what business wants. It's actually what the European Union wants. It was quite clear that they welcomed the clear result of the general election because it provided a clear pathway forward instead of us to continue to go round and round in circles. And if I could just say to members of the party opposite that have made very, in their view, I'm sure, valid points about some of the things that are now missing in this bill that were in previous bills, you had your chance. You could have voted for the withdrawal agreement back in the spring, and you would have had the things that today you're mourning the loss of. You could have backed this withdrawal agreement just a few weeks ago, and the things that you regret now are missing would have been in that bill. But you decided to play politics. I'm sorry, Mr Deputy Speaker. The party opposite decided to play party politics and engage in a huge gamble. Well, I'm sorry, the gamble was lost. The British people have spoken. We're going to end the uncertainty. We're going to deliver Brexit. And the third reason for me is that it does path a way for our future outside of the European Union. It provides the way for a free trade agreement. And I do believe we can secure that by this time next year, because we've seen that when there is a hard deadline, the European Union can move quickly and will move quickly. So I actually welcome the inclusion of that hard deadline that says we will not extend and delay any further, but we will focus on making sure we get that trade agreement with the EU. But also it opens us up as a country to the rest of the world. As far from saying we will diminish our place in the world, I believe that the passing of this withdrawal agreement, of this bill, as we leave the European Union, paves the way for a truly global Britain to engage with the rest of the world. Sometimes it seems as some of the things that are said in this chamber is the world is just the European Union. It's not. There is a great big world outside of the European Union, and I look forward to us being able to engage with that as an independent nation once again.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Sir Gary. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair.